Okay. The general topic tonight is fantasy and culture. When Tom approached me sometime last fall, sorry, this is going to continually go all weird. When Tom approached me last fall, or emailed me last fall, about speaking, he originally asked if I'd talk about either G.K. Chesterton or George MacDonald. I could have spoken about either of them, but I suggested this topic instead, fantasy and culture. At the time, when I suggested it, I was thinking about talking about fantasy's role in culture and what we mean by it. Which one do I turn?
Right now.
Test?
Did you hit record?
Can you guys hear me? Yes. You can hear me now, okay. So I originally thought that I would talk about the role of fantasy in culture. But I think I'm going to change it up a little bit. And I've got prepared remarks, but I'm going to kind of do what I do in class. So, at the 3-hour mark, you might want to stop me because that's usually what I have at work. When we talk about fantasy and culture, we've got to talk about both terms, and we have to understand both terms. So for the Tolkien aspect of fantasy, I'm going to use Tolkien's definition, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But culture generally, what do we mean when we talk about culture? Anybody? Throw it out there.
It's kind of like zeitgeist, but that's more of a product.
Okay, zeitgeist, spirit of the age, okay, that can inform the culture. Mm-hmm. Culture, strictly speaking, or even not strictly speaking, is merely the product of humanity. So it differs from one place to another, from one culture to another. European culture versus American culture versus South American culture versus Asian culture, etc. Okay? So you have differing cultures. For purposes of us tonight, we're going to focus on United States or American culture. Okay? So that's that side of the equation. What about fantasy? What do we mean when we use the word fantasy? Oh, that's a fantasy. Don't go off into the illicit fantasies. I had students do that all the time. So what is generally meant by fantasy? Made up. Okay? What else? Because, I say what else because something like Catcher in the Rye is made up.
Something that couldn't be true.
Something that can't be true. Okay?
Something we don't normally experience.
Something we don't normally experience. Okay? Give me an example. Give me an example from film.
Horses that fly.
Okay, horses that fly. Fledge if you are a C.S. Lewis fan in the Chronicles of Narnia. Okay? So horses that fly. Nobody's ever seen one, right? I hope. Nobody's ever seen one. Okay?
Cows that fly.
Okay, cows that fly. Unreal. Okay? So in this essay, Tolkien gives his own definition kind of fantasy, and it's going to have kind of several qualities to it. Okay? And the essay that I'm talking about is one that he delivered in 1939 at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, in St. Andrews, Scotland. The lecture was simply titled On Fairy Stories. Okay? Now, when Tolkien uses the term fairy stories in this lecture, he means both what we traditionally think of as fairy stories, Hansel and Gretel, Rumpelstiltskin, Cinderella, Snow White, those kinds of things. But he also means what we understand today as fantasy literature. The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter novels, things like that. And I think you could extrapolate also from that into film. Even though Tolkien wouldn't like it because he didn't like film, essentially, you'd have to include, I believe, and I'm going to show why I think later on, you'd have to include pretty much the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of the Marvel comic books made into film. Okay? And we'll see why when we talk about what Tolkien says is fantasy. Okay? Now, he delivered this lecture, as I said, in 1939, and he was asked to deliver it pretty much for one reason. Because he published a book in 1937, The Hobbit. The Hobbit was immediately recognized, immediately hailed as kind of a paradox or an oxymoron here. An instant classic. Usually classic implies it passes the test of time, but it was an instant one. Okay? How so? How is The Hobbit, in Tolkien's terms, a fairy story, or even not in Tolkien's terms? Okay? It has that characteristic of unreality, right? That several of you mentioned. After all, I don't think anybody in here, unless you're smoking something other than cigars, has met a hobbit. Now, there are people, and I'm not kidding, literally in Great Britain who think leprechauns are real. Who will intentionally, if they're out on a walk and they go through a meadow and they see a fairy ring, that is, a ring of mushrooms, they will step around. They will not walk through that. Because of this idea that fairy rings can be, they aren't always, but they can be, at certain times of the year, come on in guys, portals to the fairy realm. Okay? Similarly, if there's a single standing stone, like the standing stones at Stonehenge, but a single one, they won't walk in its shadow. Okay? Because of the possibility it can be a portal to the other world, the fairy realm. Okay? So, Tolkien's dealing with this notion of fairy, and he was invited because he had written The Hobbit. So he starts his essay with three questions. Okay? What are fairy stories? What are the origins of fairy stories? And what is their use now? Okay? Keep in mind, this is an academic audience he's speaking to. It's undergraduates primarily, but it's an academic audience. The first two questions he kind of, in a very sleight of hand fashion, dismisses. He takes a long time to do it, but he dismisses them without answering them. He essentially says, for the first question, what are fairy stories? We can't answer that. That is, you cannot define a fairy story if you literally understand what the word define means. What's it mean? To put a limit around. Right? Like circumscribe. Tolkien says you cannot circumscribe a fairy story. What you can do is you can say what is not a fairy story. Okay? So he gives examples of what are not fairy stories, and he gives examples of what are fairy stories. What are not fairy stories? Chronicles of Narnia, according to Tolkien. Why? Because they're largely about talking beasts. And he says talking beasts aren't fairy stories. Talking beasts are merely beasts that have been anthropomorphized, given human characteristics. There's nothing fairy-ish about that. Similarly, not all fairy stories are about fairies or elves. Tolkien says a fairy story doesn't even have to have an elf at all. Okay? So, examples of stories that he says are fairy stories. The Old English or Anglo-Saxon epic, Beowulf. There are no elves, by the way. They are mentioned in one line, but that's it. Okay? The Middle English poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, both of which Tolkien wrote extensively about, by the way. Okay? Several of the works of George MacDonald. Okay? Lilith, Phantastes, Golden Key, Day Boy and the Night Girl, the Curdy novels. Those are all fairy stories. Some of G.K. Chesterton's work. Okay? So what he ultimately comes down to with this question is I can recognize what they are. And he does give a couple of characteristics. They involve what he calls the Perilous Realm. Okay? Which is a place that cannot be defined. Again, can't be limited. But it has certain characteristics. It looks often like our world. It has oceans, it has trees, it has plants, it has rocks, it has stars. But he says there is an air that blows there that is different than what blows here. Okay? So he essentially dismisses that question. What are they? I know them when I see them, but I can't tell you what exactly they are. So the second question, what are the origins of fairy stories? The short answer is, it doesn't really matter. Okay? And here's why. The long answer is, because the short answer flows from the long answer, the long answer is fairy stories are made up of elements, of tales, of myths, okay, that have been handed down for eons, for thousands upon thousands of years, going back to prehistory, back to before any writing occurred. Okay? And these elements, Tolkien suggests, are elements that for some reason we have need of. Or for some reason, the tellers of the tales thought these elements were important enough that we had need of them. So what are some of these elements? What are elements that you see in a variety of fairy tales or fantasy tales? What is an element that we see in both Lord of the Rings, for example, and the Harry Potter novels? And The Ring of the Nibelungs, Old High German. Something that confers invisibility. Something that confers invisibility will make you invisible. The Ring of the Nibelungs will make you invisible. Tolkien's One Ring will make you invisible. Some of the others will also. It's not just the One Ring, by the way. And then you have invisibility cloaks in the Harry Potter novels. Okay, so what's the common theme in all of those? Invisibility. So Tolkien kind of addresses that idea. What is it about invisibility? Why do we have this hankering for invisibility such that it keeps showing up? I mean, think of, even though I don't think they're strictly fantasy, I think they're science fiction, think of the Star Trek, both TV series and films. What's one of the elements that either the Romulans or the Klingons always have? They've got a cloaking device.
Not the droids you seek.
Yeah, or even there, even in Star Wars, which I'll talk about quite a bit more. Because Star Wars is definitely fantasy. It's Tolkienian fantasy. Okay? So, when he talks about origins, he says, there are these elements. And he uses this metaphor of a cauldron of soup. Imagine a big pot of stew. Okay? What is stew? What's it made out of?
Chunks of stuff.
Chunks of stuff, right? If you're a meat lover, you throw in meat. You throw in a variety of vegetables, carrots, potatoes, onions, etc. You throw in spices. You throw in some herbs. You throw in some water. And then what do? For how long? An hour? No. It's got to sit until it does what? Until everything kind of breaks down and melds into each other. Okay? But, what's the difference between that? Say I invited you over to my house and said, come on over, we're going to have stew tonight. And you came over, and instead of stew, I had a big buffet table laid out, and on that table was a bunch of chunks of meat, a bunch of raw potatoes, a bunch of raw carrots, a bunch of raw onions, a bunch of pots of spices, and a pot of water, and said, dig in. You'd say that's not stew. Okay? So, when you talk about the origins of fairy stories, what are you talking about? You're talking about those ingredients. You take the origins out, and what do you have? Ingredients. Do you have the story anymore? No, you don't. And Tolkien addressed this, perhaps most famously, in an essay he delivered, another essay he delivered in 1936 on the Old English poem Beowulf, which is what he was really known for, in academic circles at least. Because in that essay, Tolkien says, what all the critics up until now have done is they've looked at Beowulf and they've looked at it as a bunch of ingredients. What it tells us about ancient Germanic custom. What it tells us about gift giving, what it tells us about mead passing, what it tells us about swords and armor and notions of honor and bravery and courage and revenge and all those kinds of things. So, what scholars before Tolkien did is they took all those elements out. You take the elements out, and what are you left with? You don't have the story anymore. Okay? It's like looking at this house. You take all the bricks out, and what are you left with?
The wooden house.
Yeah. You take the wood behind the bricks out. That is, you take all the original elements out, and you're left with nothing. Okay? Gandalf famously says in The Lord of the Rings, when he's talking to Saruman, See if I can remember the quote exactly. Saruman's talking about light in whiteness. And this is when he's Saruman of many colors. He has a robe of many colors. And Gandalf says, I liked white better. And Saruman says, the white page can be overwritten. The white cloak can be dyed. In other words, the white light can be broken. And Gandalf says, in which case, he who breaks a thing to learn what it is has left the path of wisdom. Okay? Similarly, he who would take a fairy story, takes it all apart to try to get its nuts and bolts. For example, looks at the Hobbit and says, oh, all these names of these dwarves, these come from Old Norse materials. And Gandalf isn't actually the name of a wizard, he's the name of a dwarf. Okay, so you take all that out, you find it out, and what are you left with? Okay, that's interesting, but it doesn't tell you anything more about the Hobbit. So, in all that discussion that he gives about source stories, he essentially, or source studies, he essentially says, it doesn't do us any good. It doesn't help us understand better what the fairy story in particular is. Whether that fairy story is something like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, okay? You could read hundreds of articles looking at source elements in the Lord of the Rings. Or Star Wars. What are the source elements behind Star Wars? You know?
So what's the value in deconstruction?
Well, it's not deconstruction per se. That's something later. This is the idea of, trying to find the original elements, the germ idea, as Tolkien puts it in another place, of a story. How did it get its rise? For example, Arthur. Where does Arthur find his rise? Where is the earliest reference to Arthur? Well, possibly, depending upon your interpretation of the source, it's a 6th century Welsh monk who talks about somebody not named Arthur, but who talks about a British soldier who defeats the Anglo-Saxons in their invasion of Britain, who famously fought 12 battles. We know from later material, Arthur supposedly fought 12 battles. And then you can trace that idea. Okay? Is there a historical Arthur? A lot of people say there are. A lot of people say there aren't. What would happen today if tomorrow, what would happen tomorrow if the Telegraph or the Times of London reports on an archaeological dig at, somewhere in Wales, and they find not just a slate like was found about 20 years ago that has the words on it, Rex Arctur, and then the rest of it's broken off. King Arthur. That was actually found. Dates from the 6th century in Wales. Okay? What if instead they find a sword that dates from the 5th century, which is when Arthur would have lived, that has inscribed in British runes Excalibur? Okay? For most people, that would validate the myth. That would say, okay, at the very least, at this point in time, at this location, there was a sword called Excalibur. And then you would take that and say, okay, so then what do you do behind that? Do you then try to find Merlin and all the other stuff? Tolkien ultimately would say, that's nice. That's really interesting. But does that really tell us about Arthur and his battles? No. It gives us a historical basis to believe Arthur was real. It doesn't really tell us anything about the stories that develop about Arthur. Okay? So ultimately, about the origins of stories, he says, it's nice to know, but it doesn't really tell us anything about the stories per se. So he gets to his third question, which is really the important question, the one he wants to address. And this question is, as he put it at the beginning of the essay, what is the use of them? Now, think how he puts that. He doesn't say, what do they mean? Bruno Bettelheim wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment. And it's all about fairy stories and how they mean what they mean. Okay? Tolkien says, or asks, or suggests, it's a better word, suggests that we somehow use fairy stories. Really? How do you use a story? How do you use Star Wars? For example, in your everyday life. Or any story. What does the story do? And this is where he's getting at something that his friend C.S. Lewis will later develop in An Experiment in Criticism. Well, stories do on us, or they do to us, if we allow them to. That is, if we approach them as stories, as works of literary art, okay, rather than, for example, as the scholars of Beowulf did prior to Tolkien, rather than as fields to be plowed or mines to be delved for information. Okay? Both Tolkien and Lewis say we are supposed to approach a work of literary art, a story, The Lord of the Rings, and we're kind of supposed to approach it with all of our coverings off, with all of our lenses taken away, if we can, putting our preconceptions, our presuppositions at bay, and letting whatever the author says speak. Okay? Now, obviously, is this an easy thing to do? No. We're all raised in a particular way. We all have preconceptions about the world. We all have a specific worldview. We can't help but look through that worldview. Okay? But when we read a work of literature, it is incumbent upon us to try, at the very least, to see what is being said from the author's worldview. Okay? In other words, it's a matter of what? Perspective. It's all how we see something. Whether that something is a work of literature, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's culture generally. Okay? How we see something is going to determine what we understand it to be. Just right here, right now, this is an analogy I use in my classes all the time. It blows my students away, but you guys are a lot more sophisticated. If I were to hold this up and say, describe what you see, don't tell me what it is. Imagine for a moment you didn't know what it is. Describe what you see, such as color, shape, texture. What would you see?
Black rectangle.
A black rectangle, okay? And then if I do this, tell me what you see.
Black rectangle with writing on it.
A black rectangle with writing on it that just went dead, okay? It's got a bunch of little boxes on it, and yet I'm looking at the same thing you're looking at, and I see a black rectangle, and you see something with a bunch of little boxes on it. So from my perspective, you're all morons, because that's not what I see. So what do we need to do? We need to learn to step outside our frame of reference, so to speak, and step into that other kind of frame of reference, that other kind of perspective to see. Okay? So that third, where'd my glasses go? Oh, I got them on. Man. So that third idea, what is their use now? When Tolkien addresses that later, because he is going to address that later, when he addresses it later, what he gets to is, he rephrases it. He rephrases it entirely. He doesn't just say, what is their use now? He says, what are the values and functions of this kind of literature? That's a pretty distinct difference. Okay? And there's a reason why he makes that change. Because between answering the first two questions and getting to the third question, he brings up the issue of whether or not fairy stories ultimately are meant for children. Now, I would bet, if I had any money in my wallet, I would put it on that chair, that probably every one of you, when I mention something about fairy stories, raised certain images in your mind, certain ideas. And probably among those ideas was, but I'm an adult. I don't read fairy stories anymore. I don't read Winnie the Pooh. I don't read The Three Little Pigs. That's, what does St. Paul say? When I was a child, I acted like a child. But I grew up, and I don't read that anymore. Lewis and Tolkien both said, yeah, but when I grew up, I learned fairy stories are even more important for us adults than they are for children. Tolkien goes through in a fairly lengthy portion and suggests the equation of children with fairy stories is what he calls a domestic accident. It's an accident of the home, ultimately in the 19th century. He says the fairy stories get shuffled off to the children like we shuffle off bed or worn out living room furniture, to a nursery or playroom. It's already in bad shape. They can't do anything more to it. Okay? That happens in the middle of the 19th century. Why?
Science.
What else starts happening in the 19th century?
Science.
Science. The Enlightenment, the Industrial Age. Okay? What is science, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Age? To some extent, at least, due to fantasy, make-believe.
It gripped the imagination of everyone, so they substituted that for the fairy tales.
It tried to explain everything away.
Which is what fairy tales originally attempted to do in religion and myth, etc. Okay? I mean, just think of... Louder?
Dissection.
Okay? I was going to say, just think of The Origin of Species, 1859. What did it do? It gave a, quote-unquote, rational, ordered explanation for how we got here, rather than simply in the beginning. In the beginning is what kind of beginning? Once upon a time, it's a fairy tale beginning. I'm not talking about historicity, literality, etc. of the Bible. All I'm just saying, in the beginning is a once upon a time, or in a galaxy far, far away, it has that element to it. But Darwin shattered that, essentially, and said, no, we rise from XYZ. Okay? A 19th century poet wrote a poem that essentially, talks about this tension. And his name, as soon as I mentioned 19th century poet, left my mind. Dover Beach is the title of the poem. Thank you, Matthew Arnold. I got a couple of former English majors back here. Matthew Arnold. And in Dover Beach, he talks about the decline, of the Sea of Faith. All right? It's written in like 1867, I think. So he's talking then about this idea of faith as a means of understanding the world is in this long, slow decline. All right? So back to Tolkien. In the section dealing with children, he says, I'm going to quote a couple passages from him. He says, children are capable, of course, of literary belief when the story maker's art is good enough to produce it. That state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. He doesn't say who called it that, but it was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a 19th century Romantic poet. But Tolkien doesn't agree with Coleridge. This does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. Okay? He's very particular with his terms. That is, the author is a sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. Now, that only applies if it's a good writer. Okay? And I'll be specific. My belief. Tolkien's writing about himself in this essay. And we could talk about why. He opens the essay with a pun, and the pun is on his name. Nobody in the audience knows what his name means, but he uses an English translation for his name in the opening paragraph, and he uses it twice. Okay, it seems to me he's looking in the mirror while he's writing this. Okay, so what has he just said? That subcreation, that secondary world, is something that your mind can enter while you read it. Give me an example of a secondary world. Middle Earth. Narnia. Okay? You could even, I think, say the Harry Potter world to an extent. The world of Star Wars, or the realm of Star Wars, if you want. Okay? Some of you I know would say the Earthsea world. Okay? I've not read those, but... So what does that mean?
Why do you say to an extent about Potter?
Let me come back to that later, because there are flaws in her writing that are like dynamite. If you see the flaws, it blows up the world. It blows up the credibility of the writing. Middle Earth, I challenge you, find the flaws. Tolkien says they're there in his foreword to the second edition. He says there are problems. I don't think anybody's ever found them yet. I think they're problems because in his creator's mind, like I tell my students, when you guys are writing your papers up here, those papers are perfect. You're Terry Pratchett up here, or you're George Will up here, or pick your, pundit. But by the time I get them, it's like George Will to a 5-year-old with crayon. It's just, the transference hasn't quite worked all that well.
That's the hard part.
That's the hard part, which Tolkien's going to talk about that. I don't know that we will, because I'm going to try to watch the time. Okay? So, he's talking about that secondary world. How is Narnia a secondary world that works? When you're in Narnia, when you're really hook, line, and sinker in the novels, are you thinking about what's going on out here? No, you're not. I remember the first time I read Lord of the Rings, start to finish. Because the first time I tried to read it, I couldn't read it. I put it down. In fact, the second time I tried to read it, I got about 100 pages further, but it still wasn't doing anything for me. It was the third time, and I read it essentially in 2 days. All 3 volumes. Okay? Why? Because by the time I got to the Two Towers, I was with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chasing Merry and Pippin in the arms of the orcs. I mean, he had me completely. All right? The Harry Potter novels. First time I picked up the first Harry Potter novel, I got into it. First paragraph, I was gone. Her humor, just a little British touch in that first paragraph, boom. And I was predisposed against liking them. Because a reporter for NPR, of course, had made a comment praising J.K. Rowling and disparaging C.S. Lewis.
Oh, it's fighting words.
Okay? T.H. Reid, he had been the London bureau chief for NPR. He said, there's this great new series. He was talking about Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Great new series, but it's not like that dull, stodgy, old C.S. Lewis. And I mean, my ears went up. I was like, what? What are you saying about C.S. Lewis? So the next time I was at Sam's, about 3-4 months later, they had it. And I thought, that's that book he was talking about. I picked it up and gone. Just, convinced. Okay? So Tolkien goes on. Okay, he's talking about belief in whether it's real or do you have to suspend it. How many of you, if you pick up a novel and you start reading it and you're getting into it, or you watch a TV show or a film and you're sitting there and you're watching or you're reading, you have to tell yourself, okay, I'll give it a few more pages. I'll give it a few more minutes. What does that usually mean? It's crap. It didn't work. They haven't, what? Created that secondary world that you can go inside. Okay? For example, for me, one of the biggest, quote-unquote fantasy shows on TV. What is it? Game of Thrones. When the first volume came out, I was in Book of the Month Club or something at the time. I got it. First printing, first edition. I was stupid for having given it away or thrown it away. I can't remember which. But I tried to read that thing probably a half dozen times. Could not get into it. Okay? Just doesn't work. The Gormenghast trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Tolkien loved. Doesn't work at all for me. Every time I've tried. Okay? Tolkien allows. An author who creates a secondary world is not necessarily going to appeal to everybody. I mean, an awful lot of people hated and still hate Lord of the Rings. Okay? Many of my colleagues, have no place for this kind of literature. All right?
Tolkien didn't like Narnia, right?
Tolkien didn't like Narnia, but he didn't like it for specific reasons. For example, in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, they're making their way to the stone table. Everything's frozen. It's starting to melt. And who shows up when they're hiding in a fox den? Father Christmas. Well, stop and think about this for a minute. What's Father Christmas doing in Narnia? There is no Christmas in Narnia. There never was a Christmas in Narnia. So is he just, popping through wormholes, going to one from the wood at the end of the world, going from one place to another? That's what Tolkien didn't like about it. Because Lewis didn't create a self-contained world. Okay? You don't see things like that in Lord of the Rings. I mean, even most of the plants that he mentions are imagined, made up plants. The names of trees, the names of flowers, even the names of many animals, other than things like rabbits, okay, are things that Tolkien bases upon items from a real world, but he gives them a new character in his world. So he says this idea of a willing suspension of disbelief, he says that's a substitute. The really, really good author makes it so you don't have to sit there and go, click your heels and go, I believe, I believe, I believe. You just automatically believe. Here's an example. Well, maybe it's not an example. It's an example for me as a 15-year-old at the time. Spring 1977. What big film premiered? Star Wars. If you remember seeing that in the theaters when it first came out, what are you immediately struck? I mean, this is something nobody else had ever done. You go in, and what's the first thing you see? Words moving from the bottom of the screen to the top, but they don't go all the way to the top because they go out into infinity and disappear. It's like, what is going on here? And then once the words disappear, the Star Destroyer comes in from the top and comes down. And what do you immediately notice about it? Unlike what you would see in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey.
It's fast.
Okay, it's fast. Ships in 2001 are fast. But the ships in 2001 were all brand spanking new. It's like they just came off the assembly line. There's no marks on them. Star Destroyer has blast marks. Okay? Just those two things kind of tells you you're not in Kansas anymore. And it makes it seem real. And then the rest of the imagined world, okay, within those first three, works perfectly. We won't talk about the next three. Because those are all, I don't mean this, well, they're moneymakers, but they're abortions. Or they should have been abortions. I mean, he should have just, they're horrible, okay? So, talking about children, Tolkien says, it's one of the lessons of fairy stories, if we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture. You know, notice what he's just said. Fairy stories don't lecture. What does he mean by lecture? Like this?
They don't try to,
They don't try to
tell you something.
They don't try to teach you something. They don't ram an idea down your throat. For example, how many of you have read any of Frank Peretti's novels? Man, I haven't thought of him in 20 years. Okay? Or Tim LaHaye's novels.
Oh,
If you want to call those novels, but what are those doing?
they're like
Baseball bat to the head, right? And that baseball bat has written on it, Bible, boom. You're being beaten with it, okay? Until you submit, essentially, right? Chronicles of Narnia. Now, to get back to what I earlier said, depending upon where you stand, depending upon your perspective, you might say, yeah, Chronicles of Narnia is awful preachy. Generally, okay, there's wide latitude here. Generally, the most people who say the Chronicles of Narnia are preachy are, and I don't like using labels, but I'm going to, atheists. For the simple reason, they don't like what's being preached, per se. Now, when you read the Chronicles of Narnia, must you understand Aslan as Christ? No. It works simply on the basis of a story. A talking lion who's the son of the emperor over the sea, who rules Narnia kind of in absentia. He comes back every now and then, okay? You can read them just like that. You don't have to go any farther. You can read the Space Trilogy just as pure science fiction. Now, Lewis did say in a letter, however, that he realized after writing Screwtape, okay, people are stupid. And I can smuggle theology in romance. I mean, he used that exact language. Smuggle theology in romance. He wrote the Space Trilogy to do exactly that, to get religious ideas across. Tolkien doesn't like that, because that essentially, you take it to its logical extension, that's allegory. Think of, what's the greatest allegory in the English language? Anybody know? Pilgrim's Progress. In Pilgrim's Progress, what is Christian always? Christian. He's never Jew. He's never Muslim or Buddhist or Shinto or atheist. He is always and forever will be Christian. And the Slough of Despondency will always be a slough and despondency. It can never be anything else. Okay? But Peter isn't necessarily Peter, the bishop. He might be, depending on how one reads it. Aslan isn't necessarily Christ. He might be at times. What does it mean? What do you have? What has to happen for Aslan to become Christ for a reader? Louder?
Well, no, you'd have to know Christ.
Okay, you'd have to know Christ. What else? You got to go down multiple levels.
It's a Christian reading.
Okay, it's a Christian reading. It's perspective. In other words, if you have the eyes to see, you will see. Does that mean if you don't have the eyes to see, you're damned to be a bad reader of the Chronicles of Narnia? No. That's what too many people, I think, mistakenly understand. Oh, Lewis meant the Chronicles of Narnia to be about, this Christian idea. No. Tolkien doesn't mean the Lord of the Rings to be about the dangers of nuclear weapons. It's the farthest thing from his mind. Or the Second World War, as people have suggested. Farthest thing from his mind. Okay? It's about something else, which, if we get to, we'll get to. Okay? So, I finished that one quote in the middle. I didn't get to the main part, so let me back up. It is one of the lessons of fairy stories, if we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture, that on callow, lumpish, and selfish youth. Okay, he's not saying all youth are callow, selfish, and lumpish. He's talking about specific youth. Peril, sorrow, and the shadow of death can bestow dignity and even sometimes wisdom. What does he mean? Name a character from the Chronicles of Narnia who hasn't read the kind of stories Tolkien is talking about.
Eustace
Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Useless Scrubs, as I like to call him. Eustace. What has he read? He's read nonfiction books about the economic output of Nicaragua, Lewis says.
alligators and fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools.
Exactly. He hasn't read about knights battling giants and dragons. He hasn't read things about honor. He hasn't read one of the best series ever written, okay? The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Not a Christian, but who says Christianity informs his work because it's pretty important for what he wants to say. Not that he's preaching Jesus or anything. Notice, fairy stories can bestow dignity, they can teach sorrow, and the shadow of death can bestow dignity and even sometimes wisdom. You know, I'm a college professor, as was mentioned. I teach an awful lot of people who are callow, lumpish, and selfish. You've read about them in Middlebury, Harvard, Yale, Mizzou, Berkeley is full of them. Why? I think for one very good reason. They haven't read the right kind of books. What do I mean by that? They haven't had this challenged. They've been spoon-fed one way of thinking all their lives and have never come into contact with another perspective. And when they do, I was going to say they shrink back, but they don't. They mob. And they shut down somebody else who differs from them.
Very afraid. They're very afraid.
Oh yeah, they're extremely afraid. Okay? So, if fairy story as a kind is worth written, Tolkien says, it's worthy to be written for and by us. Why? What's the difference between us and children? Some of you might have 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, or grandchildren who are 5 or 6 years old. What's the difference between a 5 and 6-year-old and a 55-year-old? Experience. Experience of what? Life. What does that do to you? Gives you wisdom.
Gives you perspective.
It gives you perspective. What's the negative side of giving you wisdom?
Makes you cynical.
Makes you cynical. Makes you jaded. Okay? So that all too often, I won't say this about any of you, I'm going to say it about me. All too often, I don't see the wonder, the glory of the world. So that when I was younger and we would go for walks or hikes or something with our kids, and one of my kids would see a rock or would see a bottle cap or would see a piece of quote unquote trash. Look, Daddy, look at this. Isn't it amazing? No, it's a piece of garbage. Put it down, Nathaniel. It's like, blow that idea just completely out of your mind. Okay? He saw it from the eyes of what? Wow. Isn't this cool? In other words, was it just a rock? No, that rock, for those of you who are Orthodox, that rock was like an icon. It was a window into something much, much more than just a rock. I saw it as just a rock. You don't know who's picked it up. You don't know who stepped on it. You don't know what animal has done whatever on it. Put it down kind of a thing. Okay? So Tolkien says, we adults, we need these kinds of stories. Very well, quoting Tolkien. If adults are to read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, that is, like drama, like poetry, like fiction, neither playing at being children, that is, pretending to be a child, nor pretending to be choosing for children. I did this. When my wife was pregnant with our eldest child, I was a PhD student. I'd gone to the doctor, the health clinic at the university at southern Mississippi, because I had a cold, and I brought in with me Winnie the Pooh. I was reading Winnie the Pooh. And she looks at me and she's like, well, I don't really see many graduate students reading Winnie the Pooh. And I was immediately like, oh my God, what am I going to say? Well, my wife's pregnant. I'm refreshing my memory so that I can tell I wanted to read Winnie the Pooh. And yet I wasn't courageous enough to just say, what, you have problems with Winnie the Pooh? Where are you, a Pooh hater? Not pretending to be choosing for children, nor being boys who would not grow up. Peter Pan, who he talks about earlier. What's the problem with Peter Pan? The character, not the story.
He won't grow up.
Why won't he grow up? He's afraid. Because what comes with growing up? Responsibility. Responsibility, loss of wonder. He doesn't want to lose that. So he tries to freeze himself. How many of you know 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old Peter Pans? People are just, continually chasing that elusive whatever it is. I mean, Botox sales and makeup sales and plastic surgery are all part of the Peter Panization of our culture. So, if you're not doing any of those things, what are the values and functions of this kind? Values and functions. How does this kind of literature work? Tolkien says, well, first of all, if written with art, that is well done. The prime value of fairy stories will simply be that value which, as literature, they share with other literary forms. And I love this line because I always ask my students, well, what is that prime value that literature has? And it's just dead silence. Whether I'm talking to English majors or students who are just getting their one English class so they can graduate. Okay? Why do we read works of literature? And I don't care how you define works of literature. To inform and understand. Why else? Do you read, if you read, any of you have read Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, do you read those to get an understanding about the world? Does it inform you about the world? Probably not. Okay?
It invokes a sense of wonder in us.
Okay, those can evoke a sense of wonder. Horace, first century Roman writer, said purpose of literature was twofold: to teach and to delight. An awful lot of authors try to do the teaching part. John Bunyan. Don't get me wrong, I love Pilgrim's Progress. Okay? An awful lot of writers try to do the delight part without any message per se. They usually fall flat if they're trying to just delight. Because anybody who's going to spend a year of their life writing a novel definitely has what? Something to say. Okay? They may not even be aware of what it is they're trying to say. So, Tolkien says, but in addition to that prime value they share with other literary forms, they do 4 things for us adults. Okay? 4 things. Fairy stories offer fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. All things of which children have as a rule less need than older people. Most of them, that is, fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation, nowadays very commonly are considered to be bad for anybody. What's one of the major criticisms? You hear about films like Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't care what your critical perspective is on it, but what is one of the things you often hear about things like that, or the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe? It's pure escapism. So, Tolkien's going to talk about that's actually a good thing. If you think about what it is people want to escape from, okay? So, first thing he addresses is fantasy. What does he mean by fantasy? And we get back to the opening question of tonight. What is a fairy story? What is fantasy? Well, Tolkien looks at the word both etymologically and how it is used today. And it encapsulates a bunch of different ideas. For example, fantasy encapsulates what we today understand simply as the imagination. Right? You can come up with, up here, something that doesn't exist out here. Everybody in this room has at one point or another. You've imagined something that is not real, has never been real, in some instances, hopefully never will be real. Okay? I used to always, growing up in California, land of earthquakes, earthquakes don't bother me. I was in a 6.5. Yeah, you rock and roll a little bit. It's cool. Okay? Always wanted to see a tornado. Just really wanted to see a tornado. Until March of what year was that? 2009 or 2010? Saw two up close and personal in Murfreesboro. One hit the church, caved in the roof over the altar. The other was the big F4 that hit 200 yards from my house. As I was getting ready to go to an appointment, all these cars are pulling off to the right. And I'm like, what's going on? And I turn and look to the right, and there, not literally a quarter mile away from me, is this big black V coming straight at me. So I jam my car in reverse, go back to my house, and like the dumb fool I am, stand on the porch and watch it, while I get my kids underneath the stairs. Don't really want to see a tornado anymore. That aspect of what I imagined was all too real now, okay? So what else does it include? So it includes fantasy, or imagination, the creation of things in the mind that are not real in the world. What else does it include? He says it also includes the expression of that idea. So how do you express that idea? Well, summer of 1931, Tolkien was grading entrance exams to Oxford. He was sitting in his study over his garage in his house. Window was open, breeze was blowing in, and he has a blue book, and he finishes marking his student's essay. He turns the page, and there's a blank page, and he just writes in pencil on that page. I've seen it. I've held it in my hands. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And he doesn't write anything else. He goes on to the next essay. He had no idea at that moment what in the world a hobbit was. He had never seen the word before. Nobody had seen the word before. Though we come to understand later, the word actually does show up. It is included in the OED, but it's not a section of the OED that Tolkien had any knowledge of or any awareness of. It's not a word he had ever seen. It's something up here. Okay? Just came out of nowhere. So, you have the idea, the expression, and the expression when it is complete. Okay? The expression Tolkien calls art. So the idea, art, and then the product. Well, what's the product? For Lloyd Alexander, it's the final book in Chronicles of Narnia, the High King. The product is what Tolkien calls the sub-creation. Sub, beneath creation. Okay? Why? Because none of us are creators. Again, Tolkien, being a master of the use of language, is very, very particular with how he uses language. There's only one creator. Each of us, if we create something, the cigars you are smoking, those cigars are made from what? They're made from leaf. You didn't make that leaf. Similarly, if you write a story, Flannery O'Connor's Good Man is Hard to Find. Great story. I'd love to talk about it sometime. Did she create everybody in that story out of nothing up here? Ex nihilo? No. She drew aspects of people from the real world and drew them together to create the misfit, the grandmother, the perfect church lady, if you will. Bailey, the father, the two brat kids, John Wesley and June Star, the unnamed mother, who's always and only described as having a cabbage-like head because she always has a kerchief tied over her, which has like rabbit ears. But the wife is never named. Okay? Lord of the Rings. Everything in there, Tolkien says, ultimately has its basis out here. Okay? Similarly, an artist, a painter, uses colors. Where do the colors come from? The world around us or the world beneath us. Okay? A musician uses what? Sounds. They're all things that already exist. Yes, nobody else prior to him did da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Beethoven was the first. Other people have, used it since then. Okay? So, fantasy incorporates those three elements. Now, if that product, that subcreation, Tolkien says, is done well, it has what he calls a fairy quality. That is a quality of the fairies. And he's talking about kind of medieval literature here, where in some medieval literature, people run into fairies and they see the fairies and they think that what they're seeing is real. And the way Tolkien talks about it, it sounds like he believes that it's really real, that there really are fairies and that they can kind of transform you, enchant you, etc. So he says, when this kind of art is done really well, it produces enchantment, not magic. And he distinguishes magic from enchantment. Enchantment says, psst, come here. I want you to see this. You've got to see this. This will blow your mind. This is wonderful. Let me share it with you. Magic says, you will do this, you will understand, you will enjoy, like me to my kids. You will have fun, whether they want to or not, okay? So that's all part of fantasy. He also says two other things about fantasy. One, it has to have arresting strangeness in order for it really to work. In a hole in the ground there lived a what? Excuse me, I didn't quite hear that. A hobbit. That's arresting strangeness. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's arresting strangeness. Okay? Finding out on your 11th birthday that your parents did not die in a car wreck, but they were instead killed by the most powerful and evil dark wizard who ever lived, and he's after you. Yeah, that's kind of arresting strangeness. Hiding in a wardrobe and finding out the wardrobe doesn't have a back. And you keep going in, and you can go further up and further in, ultimately. Yeah, that's arresting strangeness. Okay? So he explains this, and he talks about fantasy, and he says why we do this. Because everybody does. In a very trite, banal fashion. This is an example of art. Some of them are more artistic than others, I will admit. I mean the arrangement. Now, maybe it's entirely haphazard and postmodern in that sense. It's entirely random. But everything we do, the clothes you put on, is an element of art. Okay? You might not be trying to convince somebody that you're an other world that they should get to know, or maybe you are, but that can be the goal. All right? So in talking about this idea of fantasy, he says we do this because we can't help ourselves. Why? Because we make in the image we are made. Okay, keep in mind, he's addressing a bunch of undergraduates. And he's talking about Christian theology, essentially. We're made in the image of God. God is a maker. Therefore, we are makers. And he quotes a poem, which I'm going to quote too. I'm trying to keep an eye on time. Because it's pretty important, because one, what he says in the poem, two, why he says it, that is who he's responding to, and the person that he's responding to. And the poem is from a longer poem called Mythopoesis. And Tolkien writes that, let me quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote. Am I lost again? From a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy story as lies. Though, to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making, breathing a lie through silver. And Tolkien writes, this is the part of the poem. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed, we make still by the law in which we're made. Now the person he writes this to is C.S. Lewis. And he writes it to Lewis before Lewis is converted. Lewis was the one who said, myths and stories, fairy tales, they're nothing but lies. Beautiful lies, yes. The myth of the dying god, it's a lie. But it's a pretty lie. Is it still moving?
Yeah, I'm sorry, but
It's
they
okay.
can't hear you inside.
Imagine you're Britney Spears.
Wow, now there is a fantasy I don't want to go to. I can hold it if
Okay,
that's
yeah.
necessary.
Yeah, now that
Okay. So it's Lewis before he's converted. Tolkien was instrumental, obviously, in his conversion, as I'm sure most of you know. So what's he saying? Fantasy is a natural human activity there. And then he says this sentence, which is, I think, actually one of the most profound sentences in all English literary criticism. Creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, upon a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. Now think of what he's just said. Creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun. What did we say was one of the criticisms leveled against fantasy, against, Marvel movies and stuff? They're escapist. Okay, we'll just do it this way. They're escapist. Okay? Tolkien says fantasy is what? It's based upon this world. And it recognizes this world is the way it is. What does he mean? ISIS, AIDS, cancer, death, poverty, hunger, child pornography, sex trafficking. Pick all the worst things of the world. Okay? Creative fantasy recognizes all of those, Tolkien says. All right? A recognition of fact. But then what's the last part? But not a slavery to it. What does that mean? If it's not enslaved to it, what does it say? It doesn't have to be this way. And I think he's echoing 16th century English poet, literary critic, soldier, Sir Philip Sidney in his Defense of Poetry, where he essentially said, the poet is the greatest of writers, because the poet says what may be. The poet is not like the historian. The historian is limited to what?
Yes.
Was.
Sometimes.
You know,
Elements of it.
unless you're going to be a revisionist and say what was is not what was, but, you know,
Goes to perspective.
okay. So, he's saying, if it's going to be really good fantasy, it acknowledges the problems of this world. So how does the Harry Potter stories, the Harry Potter universe, how does it acknowledge the problems of this world?
It recreates the bureaucracy.
Okay, we see the bureaucracy, the Ministry of Magic in all its glorious detail. What else? What do we see early on when Harry's introduced to the rest of, if you've read them, to the rest of the Wizarding world? What is there just as much as it is in Harry's Muggle world? Racism, prejudice, jealousy, fear,
Slavery,
greed, slavery, injustice in the sense that the ministry of justice is not just. I mean, look at the legal perspective in the Harry Potter novels. Wow, is it scary. You know, people can go and change somebody else's mind without a judge, without that person's approval. I mean, it's really scary. You can get sent to prison without a jury trial. You can be killed without any kind of trial. Okay? So Tolkien says fantasy acknowledges all that. So then he finishes the section on fantasy and goes to recovery. And all he means by recovery, and recovery is the shortest section in the entire essay, is regaining of a clear view. Think that you all wear these. Except rather than being clean, they all have a film of dirt or dust on them. And we walk around all day, every day, all of our lives, seeing through dirty lenses. Tolkien says what recovery does is it clears our lenses. It enables us to see as we are meant to see. Okay, so what does that really mean? He talks about it in the sense of possessiveness. Okay? He says, we need in any case to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Okay, think about that. Familiarity. What word is related to that? Family. How can family become trite? You see them day in and day out, right? If they live with you. Every morning, every evening. If you're a stay-at-home mom, all day long. Or a stay-at-home dad, all day long. Okay? All the time. Husbands, you see your wife every day, unless you travel a lot. In which case, when you're home, you still see her every day. You wake up in the bed, there she is. You go to bed, there she is. What's his point? Well, what happens, my wife and I just celebrated our 32nd anniversary. What happens after, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years? The drab blur of triteness or familiarity. In other words, and I always use this example in my classes, probably on our 15th anniversary, I didn't look at my wife the same way I did 3 months before we got married, or 3 months after we got married, or 3 years after we got married. Why not? Because she's like this. It's like, she's probably in there cursing me. It's like I own her now. And she owns me. We've become so familiar with each other, Tolkien is implying, we don't see each other. Families don't see each other as what? Distinct, individual. But he kind of extrapolates from that to mean seeing what else? everything is being distinct from me. Why? What do people have a habit of seeing everything as, or seeing everything in relation to? Me. The only reason this column is important is because it's blocking me. Okay? So I don't, I always use this example with my students. They come into class, I'll do this part, and I say, now stop for a second and look around in this room. And I'd love to teach here every day because this is a lot prettier than our ugly cement block walls. I say, look at the walls. And they look at them. I say, what are they made of? Wools. What are they made of? Concrete block. And? What do you mean and? There's nothing. What's between the concrete block? Oh, mortar. What's on the concrete block? Oh, paint. Okay, so you've just recognized three distinct, different things. Now look at the ceiling, and they look up. What do you see? Ceiling. Okay, more. Ceiling tiles, tracks. In the tiles, little dots. So what's Tolkien getting at? We need to learn to recognize everything as distinct and separate. Okay? And this is getting to a point that I'm going to make a little bit later related to the film Doctor Strange. So that's recovery. We need to learn to see how we were meant to see. Okay? Escape. What's he mean by escape? Pretty clear, right? You escape from something means you want to get away from it. So you escape into a book. Why? Because your life stinks. Or your day stinks. You've had a bad day at the office. So you're going to jump into a book, or you're going to binge watch, Netflix or something for hours on end. Okay? Why? What does that allow you to do? Does it allow you to solve your problems of the day? Nope. What does it put them? Where does it put them? Okay? For while you're doing that, to use Robert's Rules of Order language, it tables them. They'll be there when you come back. They're not going to magically disappear. So when you come back, you still have to face up to that. Okay? When Tolkien talks about escape, he uses two images. He says, people talk about escape as if it's a bad thing. He says, but imagine you're a prisoner. Don't you want to try to escape? Don't you want to try to get out of that prison and go back home? Okay? And he says, what critics who disparage escape do is they confuse the flight of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Now, what is someone who deserts something? What are they doing? Louder.
Leaving his responsibility.
Leaving the responsibility. They're saying, nope, not my problem. Not my job. Tolkien gives us a great example of this in The Lord of the Rings. The character Éowyn agrees to be put in charge of the people of the Rohirrim. And then she talks to Aragorn. She says, let me go with you. I'm a shield maiden. I can do this. You're just telling me to stay put because I'm a woman. And he says, didn't you agree? Well, yes. And if you didn't agree, some other soldier or captain would have agreed, right? Well, yes. Does that mean he should have been able to go if he wanted to? Well, no, that wouldn't be right. Then why would it be right for you to? In other words, she's trying to have the flight of the deserter rather than the escape of the prisoner. Okay? And I always use this example from a film, and every time I forget the name of the film. Cuba Gooding Jr., Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins is an anthropologist studying gorillas in the Congo or something. Literally goes gorilla. I mean, he lives with the gorillas, strips naked, lives with them for 4 years, etc. Poachers come in, they start killing gorillas. He goes crazy, kills one of the poachers, gets arrested, sent back to the United States, and has to go to trial. But they have to determine whether or not he's sane. So Cuba Gooding Jr. is his psychiatrist. And there's this one scene, he goes to the prison, Stark Prison in Florida, and he looks inside Hopkins' cell. And all 3 walls are painted like the jungle of Africa. And it's a perfect analogy. He's saying, yeah, you can put me in a little 6x8 box, but up here, you can't touch me. Up here, I am free. Up here, I have escaped. Okay? So Tolkien says escape's pretty important, and he talks about the kinds of things we want to escape from. You know, Thomas Hobbes said, human life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Or as I often put it in my classes, in reference to, bumper stickers I've seen, life's a beach, and you've seen the other one,
Then you die.
change the vowel, life's a bitch. Okay? And then you die. So, if that's what life is, why not try to escape? Tolkien hated the internal combustion engine. He thought it was the most foul thing that, humanity ever existed. Noise and smog and smoke. But he says, that's a little thing. What about the big things? Hunger, poverty, disease, and the great escape, death. He says all the stories, ultimately, of elves are about the escape from death. Does our society want to escape from death? How often does our society talk about it?
Very rarely.
Very rarely. It's one of those taboo subjects. Still, even though, it, along with taxes, one of the 2 constants of life. Everybody dies. Okay? Which leads Tolkien to the final issue of Consolation. And he says, fairy stories, if they're really done well, they have to have this element. He says the consolation of fairy tales has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. And among those ancient desires are, for example, to fly. Everybody in here has dreamed before of flying. Not on a Boeing, bare arms, just, okay? Or, Tolkien talks about talking to other beings that are not human. I think that's ultimately behind the whole UFO extraterrestrial desire. I think Carl Sagan wanted there to be billions and billions, of inhabited planets for one reason. He couldn't accept being alone in the universe.
He wrote a fantasy about it too.
Yeah. Cosmos, which is in a 2nd edition, essentially. Well, yeah, you mean Contact, yeah. Which kind of very well fits what Tolkien says here. Because Tolkien says, when you go into that perilous realm and you come back, you can't talk about it. What you've seen is beyond human words. Kind of like what St. Paul talks about in going up to the 7th heaven. 3rd heaven, yeah. Beyond words. Okay? So, this consolation. Tolkien says we need a word for this consolation. Consolation won't work. He's got to come up with something. So he creates a word. Eucatastrophe. EU catastrophe. EU, what does that mean? Good. Beautiful. Okay? What does catastrophe mean? All right, let me rephrase that. What do we assume it means? Disaster. It doesn't. Literally speaking, and etymologically speaking, all catastrophe means is a sudden turn. It's a sudden change of direction. That's all it is. So if I bought a lotto ticket yesterday and won the lotto tomorrow, that would be a catastrophe. It would be a eucatastrophe. It would be a good, beautiful sudden turn. Similarly, if I left here tonight and got hit by a car turning out onto Paytonsville Road, that would be a discatastrophe. A bad sudden turn. Sudden turn in the literal sense. Okay? So, he says, the eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. And he also says This is the highest form of literature. Higher than tragedy. Higher than Hamlet, King Lear, Othello. If it's achieved. Okay? So, what does all that mean? He says, the consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. For there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well. And it's not escapist nor fugitive. In its otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous, notice the loaded religious language, grace. Sudden, miraculous grace. Never to be counted on to recur. Where does that occur in the Empire, not in Empire Strikes Back, in Return of the Jedi?
Darth Vader kills the Emperor.
Darth Vader kills the Emperor. Do you see that coming? No. You could say it's when Luke throws down his lightsaber after he's defeated Darth Vader. He's all pumped up with energy. He's full of hate and everything. And the Emperor's going, good, now kill him. And he doesn't. You don't see that coming. I think you could even say it's earlier. In other words, it's possible that there are multiple eucatastrophes and one big major one. When Luke is standing there on the bridge of that ship with Darth Vader and he says, there is still good in you, Father. I can sense it. Does Darth Vader say, you're a damn fool, kid? What does he say? Anybody?
It's too late for me.
It's too late for me. He doesn't say, nope, I don't love you, slime. What's he doing? He's acknowledging, yes, there is still good in me, but it's too late. That's pretty profound when you think about it. Okay? So, Tolkien says, it's this sudden and miraculous grace never to be recounted to recur. Where does it occur in Lord of the Rings? The big one. The really big one. The granddaddy of them all.
When the ring is thrown into the fire.
When Gollum bites the ring off Frodo's finger. You don't see that coming. Because what do we see? Not 5 minutes before then. Frodo gets to the entrance of the volcano and he says, I will not do the thing I came to do. The ring is mine. And Sam's like, oh crap, Really? I carried you here on my back and now you're turning on me? And it's only then that, Gollum goes up. And what does Frodo say later? But for Gollum, the quest would not have been achieved. See, Frodo is not the hero of the Lord of the Rings. It's not Gollum either, by the way. Gollum is redeemed, I think, by that one action. It's Sam. It's Sam. Okay? And we could talk about, these kinds of eucatastrophes and all kinds of stuff. But Tolkien wants to now move from fantasy, recovery, escape, consolation to talk about joy and relate that to the gospel. Because he says the Christian gospel is the quintessential fairy story. It's the fairy story par excellence. Why? Does it have fantasy? Think about this for a moment. Does it have arresting strangeness? A virgin gives birth. You don't get any stranger than that. Okay? What else? Does it have recovery? He who would have eyes to see, or he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay? It's got that. Escape? What does it allow escape from? Death. Believe on me and you will have eternal life. Consolation? Eucatastrophe? Tolkien says the incarnation is the eucatastrophe of human history. Because how is human history going up until that point? Not so good. Okay? But then the incarnate one gets slaughtered. What are Thomas and the guys thinking at that point? Yikes. It's a discatastrophe. I mean, what does Thomas even say when Jesus says, let us go up to Jerusalem? May as well die with them. Okay? 3 days later, eucatastrophe. Sudden and miraculous turn. How many of the disciples expected that to occur? Yeah, none. They were all up in the upper room. Why? Hiding. Okay. And, Thomas shows up 8 days later and gets a tap on his shoulder. Right after he says, unless I see him with my eyes, put my finger through the hole in his hand, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. And tap, tap, tap. Come on, do it. Okay? So that's the consolation. And Tolkien relates that because he wants to say, and does say, in heaven, in God's kingdom, he says, all fairy stories may be hallowed. All stories may be hallowed, he says. In fact, he goes on, he essentially says, all human art might be redeemed. Now, he admits, it might not look anything at all like what we thought it looked like down here. That is, take the Lord of the Rings as an example. The heavenly Lord of the Rings might not look at all like the one that we're familiar with when we read it. Good analogy is, the heavenly Lord of the Rings might be like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Because when I see Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, I don't recognize it for what Tolkien wrote. Or when I watch the Harry Potter films, I don't recognize those for what J.K. Rowling wrote. Similarly, all art that we do down here, think of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. That's a kindergartner's scrabble on paper compared to what it might be hallowed. Why? What does St. Paul say? Now, we see but through a glass darkly. So, everything we produce is what? I don't mean to be insensitive, but it's like a blind man painting. But then, when our eyes are opened, we're going to go, oh, that's what was meant. Okay? Now let me leave Tolkien aside and move to some works of literature. I mean, we've talked about The Lord of the Rings. Let's talk about kind of film culture. How does this apply to films? Or how does this apply to culture in general? Take any look at like the top 10 grossing films of all time, or the top 10 film franchises or series. The majority are fantasy. Why? Is life really so bad that we've got to go off with Iron Man to, rescue something, or Thor, or Captain America? Apparently so. In 2001, a couple of films came out that fall after another little event in New York, and Washington, and Pennsylvania. Okay? The first Harry Potter film, the first Lord of the Rings film, actually one of those came out just before, and Spider-Man, I believe. They all three have a lot of these ideas. What's the takeaway quote, so to speak, from Spider-Man? All Spider-Man nerds know this quote.
Great power comes great responsibility.
With great power comes great responsibility. Okay? What does that mean? How's it to be used? What about Harry Potter? There's a quote at the end of it. Because the character of Lord Voldemort kind of symbolizes Nietzschean thought, where Professor Quirrell says, there is no such thing as good and evil. There is only power in those too weak to seek it. To hear that line months after the World Trade Center is kind of jarring. What do you mean there is no good and evil? You look around and you see it every day, all the time. What do you mean there is only power in those too weak to seek it? Why not those strong enough to claim it? Well, as I suggest in my classes, both Tolkien's work and Rowling's work are ultimately about, if you look at them together, one idea. This idea of the renunciation of power, of turning away from power, of not accepting or not taking power. But I think if you look at kind of fantasy literature beyond just those two, including film, including the Marvel films, I think there's another idea that ties in with this. And this hit me. I was flying home from Oregon a few months back, and one of the films I could watch was the Marvel Doctor Strange. And I'd already seen it once, didn't really think it was that good. And there's this one scene when a character tells Stephen Strange, the Ancient One, tells Stephen Strange just as she's about to die. I mean, her essence is kind of drifting off. And Stephen's asking questions about, this power that he now has. And she says, "It's not about you, Stephen." Because he wanted to learn all this stuff so that he could be this world-renowned surgeon again. The whole beginning of the film is all about him. He's an egotistical, narcissistic prat. I mean, just a really unlikable person. Okay? And he gets all these powers, and she says, "It's not about you." What does she mean? With great power comes great responsibility. In other words, the power is to be used for whom? For others. In Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Narnia, he has in the last, thought I had to pull it open. In the last novel, when the character of Taran, who starts out, have any of you read that? I know some of you in the back have. He starts out as like a 11 or 12-year-old boy. He's a pig keeper, but he wants to be a hero. He wants to be a warrior. And so he tries to hammer a horseshoe into a sword and completely fails. So he goes on a series of adventures over a period of 5 books and a period of about 5 or 6 years. And these books are largely a growing of his character. It's a Bildungsroman. We see this kid develop into a man, and he learns a variety of lessons. And at the end of the series, he makes a decision, and the decision kind of comes as a surprise. And I won't say what the decision is in case somebody wants to read it. But he says, "Long ago, I yearned to be a hero without knowing in truth what a hero was. Now, perhaps, I understand it a little better. A grower of turnips or a shaper of clay, a comet farmer, that is this area called the Free Comets, or a king. Every man is a hero." Listen to this. "If he strives more for others than for himself alone." Once you told me that the seeking counts more than the finding. So too must the striving count more than the gain. So what does Alexander mean? And this is how I think it ultimately really ties it, not only what he's saying here, but this idea that is throughout good fantasy. Okay? It's always about the other. It's not necessarily about the individual hero of the tale. In other words, the Harry Potter novels, for example. Yes, we see Harry grow. And we see them focus on Harry. But what does Harry do in the novels if you've read them? He always looks outward. And when he doesn't, when he turns inward, when he gets all selfish, when he gets all whiny and petulant, that's when the horrible stuff happens. It's when even when he's whiny and petulant, when he's had some great sorrow, and he comes into contact with somebody else and their sorrow is greater, and he's like, well, can't I help you? Immediately, his problems disappear. Because he sees, one, everybody's got problems. And two, this person's problems are greater than mine. But we also see him from the beginning, saving people, even saving people he hates. Okay? So it seems that one of the issues that, or one of the ideas at least, that Rowling wants to put in there, or wants to suggest, is that, if we think of others before ourselves, maybe things will turn out better in the end. I'm not saying things will turn out all right. Okay? Think of the Lord of the Rings. Frodo, once he takes the ring, once he leaves Rivendell, his focus is on the ring, getting it to Mount Doom. He doesn't think as much about Sam. He's focusing on himself. Sam, however, never, and I mean never, thinks about himself. He's always thinking about Frodo. And when he thinks Frodo is dead, he doesn't think about himself. He thinks about the quest. He thinks about the whole of Middle-earth. If I don't do this, nobody will. So he steps up. Okay? Star Wars. The first three films, the real first three, not the prequel aborted things. What are they really about? A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Who does Return of the Jedi, the title, refer to? Is it Luke? Is it the Jedis are now back because they have a new one? Or is it Darth Vader's return? Is it Anakin Skywalker coming full circle from being Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, annihilator of the Jedi, Anakin Skywalker? After all, what does he do? He kills his master. Okay? I think it's Darth Vader. Luke's just kind of there for the ride. Luke's there to do what? He's Sam. He's there to help him. So then, if we take all these kind of as paradigms, what are they saying to the culture at large that I don't know that the culture is getting or seeing? You can look at it, with the Marvel Universe. Look at Captain America versus Iron Man. What's the difference between Cap and Tony Stark? Tony is selfish, and you could just, string on the list of synonyms. It's all about me. You got that one scene in Avengers when Cap says, you wouldn't take the grenade. And he says, no, I'd figure out a way to stop it. Though at the end of that film, what do we see? We see that change in Tony, and that he doesn't take a grenade. He takes a nuclear-tipped missile and, takes it to where it can't hurt anybody. But what's Cap saying there? You got to be willing to do what?
Sacrifice.
You got to be willing to die. Okay? What did Christ say? Greater love hath no man than this, than that he's willing to die. Is it for his brother? For a friend? What's the parable of the Good Samaritan all about? Is that a friend? Okay, the Samaritan,
Enemy.
yeah, he's not the Jew's neighbor. He's his enemy. So if you look at it from that perspective, what is fantasy really saying? I mean, at its heart, ultimately, it's Christian. Whether fantasy writers are aware of that. Not George R.R. Martin. Everything I've read about George R.R. Martin is he's He is Nietzsche. He's a nihilist. Anybody that is a good character, kill him. Okay? It doesn't mean good characters can't die in fantasy. They often have to. Okay? But it is suggesting that at the heart of this idea of story is this notion of sacrifice. Okay? And that's tied to humility. This idea that I'm not the most important thing in the world. My existence doesn't have to go on if somebody else's can. And we see that throughout the Harry Potter novels. We see that throughout the Star Wars films. We see it in Lewis. We see it in Tolkien. We see it in George MacDonald. You see it in G.K. Chesterton. You see it in Madeleine L'Engle. You see it in a whole slew of works. You see it in, Dickens is A Christmas Carol, even to an extent. Okay? With Scrooge's change. So what does that say for culture? Why don't we have, or do we need works of fantasy, especially in pop culture, TV and film, because they hit more people than reading does? Do we need works of pop culture to hit this idea stronger? Or to put it another way, as Lewis famously once said, we don't need more Christians writing Christian books. We don't need more people writing Christian books. We need more Christians writing books. What did he mean? Tolkien said in a letter, The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally a religious and philosophical work, more so in the revising than in the creation. How is The Lord of the Rings religious? Where's Jesus?
Everywhere.
Where's Mary? Where's saints? Where's the New Testament? Okay, what do you mean Jesus is everywhere?
Well, in contrast to Narnia, where like the Christological function is very heavily located in Aslan, in Lord of the Rings, you could say Christ is in Frodo, Christ is in Sam, Christ is in Gandalf, Christ is in Aragorn. Every single one of them showcase a fictionalizing of an aspect of Christ's function.
Thank you for using that language. They present aspects. They present facets. Okay? That little poem by Tolkien that I read. I'll wait for Tom to change his tape. The little poem by Tolkien that I read, he mentions splintered light. He says we are man, the sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues. What's he mean? What's the single white? God. Okay? God is the single white light. We are the splintered light. How so? We are made in the image and likeness of God. Okay? So what does that mean? And if you think about it in this way, it'll blow your mind and it might make you rethink some ideas. It's really made me rethink some ideas. That every individual who has ever lived and ever will live is an image, an icon of God. So what does that mean when that person lives their proverbial, psalmical, 80 or 70 years? And if they're lucky, 80. And then they die. What happens to that image? It passes out of the world, right? That image, that icon will never be around for anybody else to ever see, to ever examine, to ever feel, to ever touch, to ever know. Okay? So the more people you get to know, one way of looking at this, does what? It gives you more of the colors of the white. It gives you more of the pieces to the puzzle. Because each individual does what? Each individual reflects aspects of God's character. And Tom might reflect an aspect of God's character that I don't. And that Nathaniel's is different than Tom and mine. And Alex's is different than Matt's, etc. Okay? So what does that do then to, wishful destruction of one's enemies? I mean, I nearly, literally, I didn't, but it was close, nearly wept the day it was announced Osama bin Laden had been killed. Not because Osama bin Laden had been killed, but because of the way it was celebrated in the United States. It just about made me vomit. It was, and I talked about this to my students that day. I just said, I don't know about you guys, but this really angers me. And then have, who was it? Mike Huckabee, the same day, come out, oh, well, he's having a meeting in hell. It's like, woo! Kind of putting on God's big boots there, immediately ascribing judgment. Okay? Because that's not what we're called to. And what Tolkien's getting at with this idea is that everybody still contains that image. Okay? And I know there's a difference between Orthodox and Protestant perspectives and Catholic perspectives on the image of man, whether or not it's completely obliterated or whether or not it's just kind of sullied, but still there. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, we're created in the image of God. And I don't personally think, if God creates us in that image, that we can really do a whole lot to deface that. That is, to destroy that. Because that would make us ultimately more powerful. Not my understanding of divinity. Which, by the way, Tolkien says, is what the Lord of the Rings is about. God's right to honor. I read Lord of the Rings. I have never seen that. But he said in one of his essays, in one of his letters, that's what it's about. The due worship that goes solely to God. Because you have Sauron claiming that worship for himself. You have Saruman essentially claiming that worship. You have Denethor claiming it. Okay? Aragorn does not. Frodo does not. Sam does not. Gandalf does not. Elrond does not. Okay? Which is what, that Christ-like portrayal of them. I kind of prefer to call them, types of Christ. Each one of them has elements of Christ's character. So if what I've said is true, and I'll be the first to admit I could be entirely wrong, but if I'm not, what does that mean for Christian artists?
They have a lot of work to do
How?
in reanimating the vision of God, love of God and love of neighbor in a culture that has spent centuries trying to move in a different direction.
Okay.
Well, and the third love of our enemies, which Christ stressed.
Yeah. What's the title of Mother Gravilia's? The book about Mother Gavilia? Love. My wife's saying it, but I can't hear her. The Ascetic of Love. Thank you. Which is all about that. Loving your enemies. Does that mean? Well, no, I won't go there because we're talking about literature and culture. Okay, so how do you do that in culture? I don't mean in politics. I don't mean passing laws. I mean to effect the culture. Let me give you an example. I don't know if anybody in here has read this. I wouldn't be surprised if one or two of you that I know might have. If any of you read, and I meant to bring it because I can't pronounce the author's name, the recently translated into English, 2020. Yeah, Loris. Laurus. How many of you have read that? I know you have. You have. Okay. I'm speechless. Written by a Russian, set in mostly the 15th century, I believe, maybe late 14th century, in Russia, and it's essentially about a holy fool.
What's the name of the book?
Laurus, Laurus.
Dragon on the front, Dad.
My wife's read it.
Yeah, it's
She reads all the good books.
it's been compared to Dostoevsky, but that's a false comparison. It's not like Dostoevsky at all. If anything, it's like reading, if you've ever read them, the lives of the Desert Fathers. Because, it's got guys who are levitating and healing people and being here one moment and there another moment and traveling forward and backwards in time. But it is written as though it is a chronicle of one man's life from very early age to death and everybody he comes into contact with. From Russia to Constantinople to Jerusalem and back. Okay? And it's fantasy. I would say it is fantasy. It's not described as fantasy, but it's fantasy in the sense that, that Tolkien describes fantasy as being tied to the gospel. Read the lives of the Desert Fathers. They're fantasy. There's no other way to understand them. You go, St. Anthony's servant, barges in one day into a cell and he sees St. Anthony praying and he's sitting 6 feet off the ground. And he's like, oops, sorry, don't mean to. Goes back out, comes back, he's still up there, he comes back out. St. Anthony's back down on the ground. He's like, Master, he's like, don't worry about it. It happens all the time. Not to me. So that author, and I have no idea, maybe Alex does or maybe Anne Marie does, I have no idea if that author is Orthodox or Christian. I would make a bland assumption that maybe the author is, but they may not be. Okay? Lewis said we don't need more people writing Christian books. We need more Christians writing books. Okay? J.K. Rowling has said she's a Christian. She said this back when people were wanting to burn her at the stake and burn her books and all this kind of stuff. Protestant, Reformed, Church of Scotland. But she's also said more recently, her Christianity is kind of the type of, she has more doubt than she does faith. And that's, fine wherever she is on her path. Let her do what she wants. But do her books betray that? That is, people have said, where's God in your books? Lev Grossman, important critic for Time magazine, New Yorker, author himself, written a best-selling trilogy, kind of a ripoff of Harry Potter for grown-ups. He asked her when she published the 7th book, he said, where's God? He famously said, you killed God. And she's like, well, I don't think he's as absent as you say he is. Yet, where is he? Where's Jesus? They're not there, per se, other than the phrase, thank God, thank God, thank God, which is repeated throughout book 7. Seldom shows up in any of the other books. So where does this Christianity show up? Well, it shows up in Harry repeatedly putting his life on the line for his enemies and not just his friends. I mean, one of the last things he does in the 7th book is save his arch enemy from being burned alive. That's pretty gutsy, okay? But he also does something else. I mean, she actually uses this language. When he's, quote unquote, killed by Lord Voldemort, a lot of people say he wasn't really dead, he was, just mostly dead, needed Miracle Max. But that when he's killed by Lord Voldemort and comes back, Voldemort says, but I killed you. And Harry says, yeah. And Voldemort goes on and says, but you didn't really die. That is, you weren't really dead. You were mostly dead. Harry says, no, I intended to let you kill me. That is, my intention was to die. And my intention to die has therefore put a protection over everybody. Because why did he die? What's the phrase that's repeatedly used to describe Harry in the 7th book? Anybody know? The chosen one. Blows my students' minds when I say, translate that into Hebrew. Messiah. And they go, oh my God, it's all this Christian stuff. It's not, leading children off into Wiccan. And as I've had Wiccans say it does, okay? The chosen one. The anointed one. Patronus Potter. So, what does all this mean for us? How many of you, and I'll stop with this, how many of you read fantasy literature? Okay, a few of you. For those of you who don't, you don't have to answer this. Why don't you? Is it because it's not interesting? It's not well written, what you've seen of it or heard of it? Or film? If you go to films and you intentionally stay away from, let's say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, why do you? Now, I can understand reasons staying away, like I don't want my money going to, Disney or, boycotting for political reasons. I'm almost there. But is it the content? Is it the smash bangs that put you off? Because in a lot of them, yeah, the special effects detract. This is the problem I have with the Harry Potter films, ultimately. That's why I won't watch them. What they've done with the films detracts from the story. Okay, let me give you 2 examples, and then I'll stop. First Harry Potter film of Book 7, and the second Harry Potter film of Book 7. The first film includes the opening of the book. The second film includes the end of the book. In the book, there's something that happens at the beginning of the book. And it's really important. It's what I call Dudley's redemption. Harry's cousin, who has beaten him up all his life, unbeknownst to Harry at the beginning of the novel, puts a cup of tea outside his bedroom door in the morning. Harry gets up, steps outside, steps on the cup, breaks it, thinks it's a practical joke. And only later, when Harry's getting ready to leave, or when the Dursleys are getting ready to leave, and Dudley says to his parents and these other people, other wizards that are there, and to Harry, I don't think you're a waste of space. One of the witches says, well, that's not very nice. It's not saying much. And Harry says, no, you don't understand. For Dudley, that's like saying, I love you. Okay, so see what Harry's just done. He's interpreted, I don't think you're a waste of space, to mean, I love you. It's all Harry's perspective. Nobody else hears that. Okay, but we're reading the books from Harry's perspective. So that's what the author wants us to understand there. All right? That's pretty powerful. And at that point, when the Dursleys walk off, Dudley says, well, bye then. And Harry says, see ya, Big D. Only one group of people call Dudley Big D. His best friends. And what Harry is saying there, and they're not only his best friends, they are beneath Dudley. They're his gang. What Harry is saying there is, I'm one of your posse. I'm one of your gang. Okay? That gets completely omitted from the film, from the theatrical release. I've been told it's on the DVD extended version. Doesn't matter. It wasn't in the theaters. Okay? The end of the films. In the film, you get this big final apocalyptic intergalactic, battle between Harry and Lord Voldemort, and Voldemort dies. In the novel, you don't get that, first of all. You get a single exchange of spells from a wand. Okay? But before that, you have Harry offer Voldemort an opportunity to repent. At least twice. He says, I've seen the real you. I've seen what you've become. Be a real man. Try for some contrition. Create in me a clean heart, O God. I mean, I think it's Harry echoing that psalm. A broken and contrite heart thou wilt not despise. Try for some contrition. He says it twice. And Voldemort's like, you dare? And Harry's like, yeah, I've seen the real you. The real you Harry saw when he was dead was the fragment of Voldemort's soul. And we're told earlier in that novel, it is possible to take a deformed, torn soul, which I think is Rowling's way of saying a defaced, marred, damaged image of God, and making it whole again. And how do you do that? Through contrition. Psalm 50 or 51, depending on your version of the Old Testament.
Well, and that's all about David.
Yeah, exactly. But Harry...
After he murdered and committed adultery.
Yeah, but what Voldemort does is a little bit more than David. I mean, Voldemort's like the Hitler. And Harry's offering it. It's like Harry going up... It's like Eisenhower going to Berchtesgaden and say, Dolph, I know what's going to happen to you. I've seen the real you. Repent.
It's like Frodo and Gollum throughout, just consistently. Even though Gollum at times has it in mind to kill Frodo, and still calling that out.
At times, but not all the time. Yeah, it's very interesting because the very end, what language does Frodo use about Gollum? He actually tells Sam they need to do something. Let us forgive him. If you forgive what? Others their debts. Okay, 1, your debts are forgiven. 2, their debts are forgiven. You hold their debts against them, their debts are held. Frodo says, let's forgive him. If it weren't for him, the quest would have failed. Okay, questions? Comments?
You want to speak about, you said there was a fatal flaw in Rowling's...
Yes.
You spoke earlier of a fatal flaw in Rowling's
Yes.
universe. And you tell us about that and speak to this because I've only read it once, but in the Harry Potter books, I always felt like there was a sort of a ontological difference in the way she approached what I would say are like the categories, which to me, Tolkien is exceedingly specific about what things are, who things are, that, in Rowling's world, a wizard, a warlock, a witch, a sorcerer, all those things are, one that could just, they're all just synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien, in my estimation, makes very specific distinctions between all these things. To say Gandalf was a warlock would be absolutely categorically wrong. And to me, that was one of the weaknesses in her view of like magic and kind of the spiritual element of storytelling and the building of it.
Yeah.
Comment on those two things.
Yeah, I agree. A couple of comments, related to Rowling. First, more general. She's a storyteller. She's a great storyteller. She's the kind of person I'd want to sit around a campfire and say, okay, go, Joe. Just turn it on, man. I want to hear it. It'd be like watching Robin Williams in a comedy. Just, hit the on button, just let him, okay? She's not a great writer. Tolkien is a great storyteller and a great writer. But you got to give this for Tolkien. He had a lot more time. Okay? I mean, he starts writing The Lord of the Rings in 38, year after he publishes The Hobbit, and it's not published until 1954. So, 16 years? J.K. Rowling, started her novels in about 90-91. She published the first one in 97, second one in 98, third one in 99. Fourth one in 2002, and then 2005, and then 2007. 2000, 2003, 2005, 2007. Okay? So the only time she really took to hone her craft was between book 4 and book 5. Okay, where she took a little bit more time. But what else was going on by that time?
She was very famous for making movies.
She was very famous. And what else? I mean, you can go back and read news clips and everything. She had revived reading for children. I mean, she had gotten children to read more than just the, in my opinion, stupid little 60, 80-page Goosebumps books to reading 400-page novels.
Children, teen, and adults.
Yeah, children and adults. I mean, I remember the first time I taught my Harry Potter course in London, which was summer of 2003, when Book 5 came out, being on the tube, being on buses, being on trains, and seeing adults with the books. And they had the books hidden in newspapers and magazines. Because, like Tolkien says, you don't want to be an adult reading a children's book. Okay? So, I mean, she had a lot of pressure on her. I don't think she should have given in, but that's another matter. Okay? Now, some of the flaws. I probably shouldn't have said there's a fatal flaw. There's a number of flaws that, if you realize them,
They're like dynamite.
they're kind of like dynamite. They kind of make the whole fictional little world, which I describe to my students as, think of your brain as a hard drive, and you've just reformatted a portion of your brain for that world to work. And when these problems occur, it's like the drive stops reading. Okay? Here's an example. In the 4th book, one of the characters dies. Cedric Diggory dies. He's described as being with Harry when he's cursed. And he's cursed and he dies. 6 feet from Harry. He's lying on the ground, spread eagled, dead. Okay? 2 paragraphs later, he's suddenly 20 feet away. Harry hasn't moved, and Cedric Diggory hasn't moved. How is he now 20 feet away? Bad writing, that's how. And even worse, copy editing. See, I used to edit a scholarly journal, so I'd catch everybody. That's why my students hate me. I catch everything, okay? The copy editor of that book should have been fired after that. But I have a feeling that by the time the 4th book came around, because when the 4th book was published in 2000, that was the first time you could have advance orders at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other booksellers. It was the first time they had the midnight release parties, and they were huge. I think that one sold something like 5 or 6 million in the first 24 hours. Nothing like the 7th book, which sold 11 million copies in the first 24 hours. So, I think by the time the 4th book came out, the copy editor said, looks good to me. Because every word was cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Okay?
If you're an editor, you would know, too, that a publisher is going to be putting pressure on the editors based on the word of her not to mess with her text.
Yeah, though they did.
Sure.
I mean, they changed the text, between the English editions and the American editions. For example, the title of the first story, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Well, the Philosopher's Stone has a long history in the history of ideas. I mean, it goes back 3,000 years in China. Okay? The Sorcerer's Stone, however, is an entirely new invention to 1997. There had never been any Sorcerer's Stone that anybody ever looked for. Okay?
There's also the timeline too, right? Because at that point, all that revenue has to be annualized, and so those books are coming out as quick as they can get them to come out. So there's no attention at that point.
Yeah, I think so, because, you go from book 4, and then book 5 is what? It's a doorstop. I mean, book 4 goes from a little over 500 pages to book 5 over 800 pages. And I tell my students all the time, that book could easily be revised down a third of its length, and you would not miss much. Okay? Now, about some of the other stuff. Yeah, she doesn't pay attention to the detail to the level that Tolkien does. I read a funny meme on Facebook the other day, and it was something to the line along the lines of a parent tells their child something about, Harry Potter uses magic to fix his glasses, and the child says, why doesn't he use magic to fix his eyes? Why? I mean, if you can, why even bother with the glasses? Well, fifth book, J.K. Rowling introduces the idea of the time turner. Stop and think about that for a moment. And this doesn't apply just to Rowling. This is any novelist who tries to deal with time travel. We can't intellectually make it work.
Charles Williams does the best job, though.
I agree. Because he's not specific. Okay? I mean, if you invent a little bauble you can wear around your neck that you just turn 3 times and you can go back 3 hours in time, why can't you turn it and go back, I don't know, at that point in the series, about 72 years, and keep Marape, Gaunt, alive, so that she raises her son and gives him love? Or, if this is your mindset, why not go back in time and abort the little future Hitler? I mean, if you can go back in time, you can go back in time, and you can stop all the problems. You could go all the way back to the founding of Hogwarts, and, I don't know, give Salazar Slytherin some weed and make him more likable or something, and have him just get along with everybody. You introduce things like that, and that's where the term deconstruction applies. You just pull that thread, and that's where you have to go, okay, I believe this is silly, but I'm going to keep with it. Okay. Other questions? Yes, use mic.
So this is something I've been wondering about off and on ever since I heard you refer to the rock as an icon in your example of your son.
Oh.
Okay, at the beginning. This has to do with how theology might tell stories or deal with stories. The Protestant theologian, Peter Leithart, who's come to this group a couple of times and is going to be here again later this year, he has written about Flannery O'Connor and other Catholic novelists as saying they have a sacramental view of the world and what makes their fiction so amazing, difficult to just pin down as simplistic, and drives the narrative along is the sacramental view that, the wooden leg is not just the wooden leg, etc., right? Jody Bottom has written that the novel is a quintessentially Protestant art form. Jody Bottom is a Catholic. So here you have a Protestant envious of what the Catholics can do, and you have a Catholic envious of what the Protestants can do. How is it that those views are reconciled?
I don't know that they are. Yeah. I don't know that they are. Simply because I don't know that I would agree with Bottom's assessment that the novel is a quintessentially Protestant product. Ovid's Metamorphoses are novelistic. They predate Protestantism by a good 1,500 years. There are earlier works that have been read as proto-novels, okay, that also predate the Protestant world by a long time. So I'd have to read what Bottom actually says to see the basis for that statement. Now, I entirely agree with what Lyart says about Flannery O'Connor. I mean, I teach just about every summer. A good man is hard to find. It's simply one of the most profound things ever written. Read. No, it's not terrible. I'll come back and talk about it.
That's not the first time I read it.
Listen to Flannery O'Connor read it. It's on YouTube. The way she reads it, it's humorous. The way it's presented on paper, it's not humorous. Okay? Well, except there are elements of humor. You know, the bratty little kids, you just need to be smacked all the time. But the interaction between the misfit and O'Connor, which is also very fantastic. I mean, when the misfit brings in Christ, he doesn't just kind of gently allude to Christ. It's, if I'd been there, then I would have known, and then I would have done what I've done. But I wasn't, so I do. I mean, you get at the whole issue of epistemology. How do we know what we know? And it's just fantastic. And because of when she's writing it. I mean, she's writing it smack dab in the middle of the 20th century, during the height of existential angst. One of her letters, she says, she writes the way I do because I am a Catholic, not though I'm a Catholic. Because a lot of people said, well, a Catholic shouldn't be writing like this. You got all these miscreants running around, town. Well, she lived in the South, and
Graham Greene, same thing.
Yeah. Graham Greene, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy. Man, just read Walker Percy.
Yeah.
Eudora Welty to some extent. Faulkner. You can't open a page of Faulkner without having, some grotesque person come across. And that's all because those are those individuals, while they're yes, real in that sense, they're also, to use the language you use, they're types. Okay? They're imaging forth. Okay? Tolkien says in a couple of his letters, he says every true novel, every real novel is an allegory. He hated allegory. And he says that because he says every character is allegorical. Just as he says every person is an allegory. We all represent things, or we represent things. And the more real a character is, the more allegorical that character becomes. But it's not allegory of the kind that Bunyan wrote, where, Christian equals Christian. It's allegory is probably not the right word for it. It's symbolic. Because a symbol isn't, if I were to just trace a cross up here, that's not just something that points to. The symbol is both the thing and what it refers to. That is, it's got to have both. It's crossing. Okay? It's the difference from diabol. Like diabolic. What does diabolic mean?
The divider.
It's breaking meaning. Symbolic is uniting meaning. Okay? So when you say somebody is a symbol of Christ, Aslan, well, he's a lion first and foremost. But if you have the eyes to see, and you see that he also connects to Aslan, that then makes what you see at the end of Voyage of the Dawn Treader all the more powerful. When the kids arrive at the shore and they see the lion, and the lion does what? Turns into the lamb. Okay? Again, we're not in Kansas anymore. I mean, You immediately know you've entered the realm of what, who was it? Rudolf Otto called the numinous, and that Lewis calls it also the numinous. You know, you're on dangerous territory. Okay. Another question or other questions?
I was just gonna. I was just gonna ask: do you see that science fiction is also fantasy based on the definitions that we were going over today? I just look and say there's a lot of times where science fiction does exactly the same things.
I think there can be. And it depends on the particular science fiction. You know, a lot of people say, for example, Star Wars is science fiction. I don't think it is at all. It is in some characters. I mean, the Death Star. It's a technological marvel. Blasters are a technological marvel. What does Han Solo say? Hokey religion and old, weapons are no match for a good blaster. Luke drops the shield. He gets zapped a few times by the thing, and then he takes out the trial shots. And he's like, ooh, I can see it. Obi-Wan's saying, just trust in the Force, use the Force. So the Force is this unknowable, unreachable thing that surrounds everybody, all that kind of stuff. But when you get to science fiction like Aliens, I think it breaks down. Because what fantasy ultimately suggests or argues, here I've got to be kind of careful. I think, I'll use that qualifier. It suggests there is some form of governance to the universe. Protestant circles and Catholic and Orthodox to some extent, providence. God's governing of the universe. Okay, I usually refer to this in my classes, because I'll bring in Boethius, 6th century Roman, in his work, The Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius was a Roman. He was good friends with the emperor. He was sentenced to death because the emperor was told, Theodoric was told, Boethius is plotting against you. The emperor locks him up in prison, and Boethius is like, what? I haven't done anything. Why, God? And God sends the goddess Philosophy to him to console him. That's why it's called the Consolation of Philosophy. It's not, sit down and pick up Jean-Paul Sartre and, you'll suddenly feel a lot better about yourself. Or Albert Camus, It's not going to happen that way, okay? So how does philosophy console him? Well, he learns, the world that we inhabit has layers above it. On this world, on the realm that we inhabit, it is governed by fortune, or the goddess Fortune. And in the Middle Ages, fortune was represented as a wheel. And Fortune's wheel is always turning. And if Fortune's wheel is turning this direction, you really want to be on this side. You never want to be at the nadir. Because what's going to happen? Yeah, because once you hit midnight, it picks up speed going this way. Okay?
I cannot think of that without thinking of the Confederacy of Fences, which makes a mockery of the whole thing. But
So, fortune is what rules here. Outside Earth, beyond Earth, you then have fate. Fate can alter fortune. Fortune can't do anything to fate. Fate's behind fortune. Behind that, by the way, is very similar to the Greek system. Okay? But behind that, you then have providence. Providence is God's ruling of the universe. And behind that is God. Why? God has the final say. Buck stops there, exactly. It's the big table. That's the resolute desk. Just right there. Okay? So whatever God wills, that's what goes on and happens. And what philosophy tries to get Boethius to understand is the notion, and I just spent a day grading a graduate student paper on the function of the Old English idea of weird in the Old English poem Beowulf. Weird, kind of whatever's going to happen, happens. Okay? That, where was I going? Happens all the time in class. That God controls all this, and fate can't do anything to change God, but God can overrule fate. Oh, here's where I was going. And that ultimately, human destiny, human decisions are not, quote unquote, predestined. That is, our actions are not predetermined by God. And the way Boethius puts it is he kind of creates this mental image. Think of our lives as being on a flat line like this. Okay? The farther above that line you go, how much do you see?
More and more.
More and more and more. But we live on this flat line, so how much of our lives do we see? We see everything going backwards. We see nothing heading forwards. But if we could somehow rise outside of time and take a peek down, what would we see? We'd see a little bit of the backwards, we'd see the present, and we'd see a little bit of the forwards. And if we rose high enough, we would see what? All of our lives. And that would give us what kind of perspective? The proverbial bird's eye perspective. We'd see beginning and end. What else would we see? How actions back here, chase the rabbit all through your life, lead you to this point over here. But Boethius then takes it one step further and says all of those actions act in synergy with God's providence. Why? Where is God in the scheme of time?
It's outside.
He's outside time. Lewis calls it the eternal present. Eternal, outside time, present. So God sees time how? Now. All time, now. Beginning, end, now. So it's not like God says, I'm going to make Matt Minner do X, Y, and Z, but he's going to be responsible for it. Because that really doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because that would make Matt into a robot. Okay? So that's how Boethius attempts to deal with that issue. So I think that most what I would call good fantasy, really good fantasy, Star Wars included here, has this idea of this governing force. Now, the way the force is described in Star Wars is not as governing, but it's kind of like Rowling. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. It's much more mysterious, because what happens the more and more concrete and real you make it? Harder and harder to accept. So, you make it nebulous, and it can fit a whole bunch of little cubby holes. It can fit into the Jewish cubby hole, it can fit into the Christian cubby hole, it can fit into the Buddhist cubby hole, etc., etc., etc. Okay?
So I know you mentioned earlier that any flaws in Tolkien were in the mind of the author himself. I know one thing that's kind of stuck in my craw, and as I've done a little reading when I got older, come to find out there are some other people that thought this as well, and maybe Tolkien thought it himself, was the issue of the orcs. How can we have beings with apparently some idea of intelligence, which in our experience indicates will, that as far as we're to understand within his mythological system, are just evil by nature and apparently irredeemably so?
It's because they're not evil by nature. They were twisted. See, in Tolkien's cosmology, what were orcs originally? They were elves that Morgoth and then Sauron took and twisted, and to use the language of Lewis, bent. And bent them so much that they did, totally destroy their original image. Now, Within the Lord of the Rings, it sounds like the orcs are completely, totally irredeemable. And I can't remember where this was. I came across a letter by Tolkien, it was a month or so ago. And it kind of blew me away because Tolkien says even the orcs aren't irredeemable. But it's in a letter. It's not in the fiction. Okay? And I think he said that in the letter because, and this may be where, he said, okay, there are some problems, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. It may be that he realized, okay, if I create these characters that have will, the elves, that have good intention, etc., and then twist them so much, what does that say about, if you apply Christianity to that and then take it to its logical extension? What does that say about the ultimate power of Eru Iluvatar? It would say, he's not all powerful. He can create a rock so big he can lift it. Okay? I think, not being Tolkien,
a couple of questions maybe related to each other. You mentioned the idea of the willing suspension of disbelief, that if you're good, you don't need to invoke that. Do you have a name for that concept? And then maybe a related question, do you believe there's a connection between people who have the ability to, or the likelihood to have some sort of faith and their likelihood to read fantasy or fairy stories?
Address the first one, and then I'll ask a question about the second one. Tolkien just calls it literary belief. He says it's not a willing suspension of disbelief. It is literary belief. You believe it while you're reading it. It has the ring of truth. And so while you're there, while you're in it, everything, and if it's written with art, if it's well done, if there aren't little pockets of dynamite, it just goes on and you don't have any issues with it. For the most part, I think, for example, Rowling's work does this. But there are a couple of dozen within the 7 novels, just seems like 12 sometimes. There are a couple of dozen elements that, for me, they are like cached IEDs. They explode every time I read them. Okay. The second question, what do you mean by reading? I'm not sure I understand it.
Are you more likely to buy into the literary belief if you have an existing system of belief?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I was just reading today an article by this critic, Lev Grossman. I came across it the other day and saved it. Who's an atheist, okay, raised in a family, he says, that had very little religion. His mother was Anglican by birth, but nothing else than that, okay. He's an atheist, okay. He's very avowed about that. And he says, C.S. Lewis did it for me. He said, I don't know how old I was, but could not have been younger than 7 or 8. But he said, I read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he had me. And he says, and he still does. He said, I don't entirely understand how he does it, but he writes with such economy. He said, he writes the Chronicles of Narnia like Hemingway or Joyce. Well, if you've ever read Hemingway or Joyce, that's not C.S. Lewis. But what he means is economy of words and clarity of expression. I mean, the example he uses is look at Lucy going into the wardrobe. He doesn't use all this florid description. He doesn't bring in these medieval images. She goes into the wardrobe, she hides, she turns around, she wants to feel where the back is, she puts her hand out, she can't feel the back, so she takes a step. She takes another step, she starts noticing crunchy stuff under her feet, she thinks it's mothballs. And then she notices she's no longer brushing up against fur coats. These things that she's brushing up against are kind of scratchy. And then she realizes she's cold. She looks down, she puts her hands down, and it's cold stuff at the ground. She takes 2 more steps, she looks, and it's snowing, and there are trees, and there's a lamppost in the distance. I mean, like maybe 50 words. And you go from World War II England to Narnia without, in a galaxy, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, yeah, or twisting a thing 3 times, or, okay, let's make believe. And then, when the children, Susan and Peter, meet with Professor Kirk to ask about, okay, I don't know who to believe here. Do we believe Susan or do we believe Edmund? Okay. He's like, well, which one usually tells the truth? Well, it'd be Susan. Well, then why would you doubt her now? Well, because it's unreal. Well, how do you know? Well, how do you know? Okay. There's a scene in the Harry Potter novels where, in the 7th novel, where they're talking with this character, and the character Hermione has a hard time believing that the quote-unquote Deathly Hallows can be real. How can there be a real stone that, if you have it, can bring back the dead? Well, how do you know there can't? Well, that's a stupid question. No, it's not. How do you know there isn't one? Well, what do you mean I need to do? Go find every stone and turn it over? Well, that'd be a good beginning. I see you're starting to open your mind a little bit. In other words, she's operating, to use an old name that some of you might be familiar with, she's operating from the perspective that Francis Schaeffer used to talk about as a closed system. And everything has to exist in this closed system. Okay? And the character of Xenophilius Lovegood there, he's saying, it's not a closed system. To paraphrase Hamlet, or to bring in Hamlet, there's more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. In other words, Hermione is a logical positivist. Only what's real and what can be seen. Keep in mind, this is a witch we're talking about, who can do magic. But only what's real and what can be seen and what can be quantitatively evaluated is real. And Xenophilius Lovegood, the name means an awful lot, by the way. Love of others, love the good, okay, the summum bonum, says, no, the world is much, much wider than you are thinking of. Expand your horizons. And it's only later on that she kind of starts to see. Okay? So I don't think you have to be a person of faith. There are a lot of people who read fantasy and who write fantasy literature who aren't people of faith. For example, I don't believe Lloyd Alexander is a Christian. I'm pretty sure a colleague of mine, he and I are the only ones that kind of share ideas. So we get together every couple of weeks and drink and smoke cigars and commiserate. But he was telling me about Alexander, this notion that he intentionally includes Christian imagery in symbolism, though he's not a Christian, because it does what he wants his novels to do: teach virtues. And he talks. I mean, I could show it. I've got a printing of quotes from him. He's talking an awful lot about virtue. And he distinguishes between children's literature and adult literature. He says adult literature, most of it's crap, because it's full of nothing but despair. It kills hope. Children's literature instills hope. It raises hope. It says there can still be good in the world, whether it's written by an atheist or a Christian. Other questions?
What would it take for an atheist writer to write a good Christian book? Like the one you were saying when we don't need more Christian books.
Who's saying that? Oh, back there. I'm like, I am losing my mind. Sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
All right, so what would it take, what do you think comes together when an atheist writer is writing a good Christian book? Not the books that you mentioned as the Christian books, but the sort of books that you were saying we need more of them because Christians are right.
Well, I'll use Lloyd Alexander again. books that are about or that incarnate virtues and virtuous behavior. For example, in the series, The Chronicles of Narnia, the young hero, Taran, meets a prince. He meets two, actually. One is Prince Gwydion, and he's the quintessential hero. Everybody looks up to him. Rugged. He's Aragorn in another body. Okay? But he meets another character named Ellidyr. And he's the exact opposite. He's the Gollum form of Aragorn. He is selfish. He is greedy. He is narrow-minded. He is entirely narcissistic. Okay? And it's probably because his family is poor. He comes from a lousy little kingdom in the north. And all he has is his name. Okay? But within the course of the novels, Ellidyr does something extremely virtuous and heroic. He sacrifices himself for the good of Taran and others. In other words, he turns. He has a catastrophic moment. It's the good, sudden turn. Okay? Now, Alexander wrote that, I think because he wants that kind of behavior to be emulated. He's trying to say, as the Ancient One says to Stephen Strange, it's not about you. And this is, this is the problem, I would say, with the vast majority of the college students who are protesting and everything on college campuses these days. For them, everything is about them. Everything is about me. What I want, what I need, what I deserve, what I am owed by society, by the school, by the government, by my teachers, etc. Rather than, what did JFK say in his first inaugural? Ask not. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I mean, imagine if we had that idea today. I mean, JFK would be run out of the Democratic Party. He's so conservative. I mean,
People run out of politics, period.
Well, yeah, that too. Okay, but I mean, it's that kind of idea. Think of Star Wars. And Rogue One. Look at the behavior of the quote-unquote good characters, if you've seen it. Okay? Think of, and I'm losing their names, the Spanish guy. Cassian and, what's her name? Jin. At the end, they know time's up. Do they try to flee? No. Do they sit there and whine and complain? No. They accept the end stoically. They have a pretty good idea the end's going to come even before the end does come. They face it. Harry Potter, at the seventh book, he walks into the forbidden forest knowing he has to die. Knowing he's been protected, he's been raised, he's been defended all these years. Why? So he can die. That's it. So he can die. He doesn't understand at that point what his death will mean. Not completely. That gets explained to him by Dumbledore in the not quite dead death. Okay. Another example of, go back to the original Star Wars. George Lucas is by no means a Christian. I'm not exactly sure what he is. There's a bit of Buddhism involved there. I think he's a smorgasbord kind of religious purchaser.
He described himself as
Buddhist Methodist. Buthodist.
Mark Hamill's religion's greatest hits is the great.
You can match those up.
And that's why you have the 1978 Christmas Star Wars special. Right?
Where's your God now?
So, if he's a Buddhist Methodist, combine those two, you still get great elements of virtue.
So they tell the truth.
Well, yeah, I mean, truth has to be a part of it because truth is virtuous.
But the truth is the truth no matter in which light it appears.
Sure.
So if somebody writes the truth, whether they're Christian or not, it's still the truth.
Here's another example. Don't know if anybody has read this. Probably Alex
It's late.
may
That's
have.
all they got.
A series of books by an author named Jonathan Stroud, the Bartimaeus trilogy. Okay, Bartimaeus trilogy is about demons. Bartimaeus is the name of a demon. Demons are what humans call these beings. They call themselves jinnies. But they come from the other place. That's all it's called, the other place. Okay? And humans enslave them through spells. And they make the jinni or the demons do their will. Magician humans do this. Commoners who aren't taught the knowledge that is necessary to do this, okay, can't make them do anything. Stroud, I'm almost positive, has no religious beliefs. Okay, I spent a few hours one day trying to just Googling him and trying to read everything I could to find. Nothing really comes up. He talks about not being a religious perspective, and yet the Bartimaeus trilogy has a lot of truths. It has an awful lot about virtuous behavior, such as treating people you come into contact with grace and good manners. It's a lot like Charles Williams's web of coherence, I think. Okay, you never know.
Coherence?
Yeah, coherence. You never know what your involvement with somebody is going to do to them, whether you are going to help them onward or downward, as Lewis says in The Weight of Glory. Okay, in these series of novels, you've got this main character, well, kind of main character, named Nathaniel, who gets a new name, John Mandrake, who comes back to his old name, who's just a horrible person in the John Mandrake part. But he learns a lesson, and he sacrifices himself for a demon. Okay, this is like David Duke sacrificing himself for Jesse Jackson. I mean, it's that extreme. Okay? Because he comes to trust and value the friendship of this individual. Other questions?
Oh, I had a couple of questions. I'll try to be brief. First, is there a difference, like say, because you take all of these stories, kind of the fantastical realm, and the elements of that Christian thought or belief that you can kind of find in them, but from a perspective of saying like education, from where you work, or in creating art, I guess there's a difference in my mind of saying like the Lord of the Rings, it's an essentially Christian message, at its foundation and in the roots of it. Whereas you take like Star Wars, well, yes, every great story has these sort of, hero with a thousand faces type of, heroic elements, but are they having a net baptismal effect, I guess, on culture? Or is Star Wars doing more to promote, Buddhism than it is to have a net?
Oh, that's a good. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, in terms of net effect, I don't know that can be answered. I think individual effect. If you talk to individuals about Star Wars, you often hear comments about, the virtues of certain characters. For example, Luke starts off how in the first film? Whiny and petulant. Uncle Luke, smack him, send him off to the sand people. Let him take care of him. Okay? And yet what happens to him? Well, what does Tolkien say? Fairy stories can bestow on selfish, callow, lumpish youth. That is the description of Luke Skywalker at the beginning. Dignity and sometimes wisdom. He learns a little as a result of the things that he suffers. The character Taran in the Lloyd Alexander novels is exactly the same, but he's a lot younger. He's a snotty 11 or 12-year-old. He becomes heroic, not because he becomes heroic. He becomes heroic because he sees that honor is not about battle or glory. A character in the novel says, man, this just struck me like a ton of bricks when I read it. There is more honor in a field well plowed than a field steeped with blood. And the guy says this to him just before he dies. And Taran's like, what do you mean? And he has another character tell him, his mentor kind of, the character named Call, who had been a great warrior, but who's a gardener. Essentially tell him, killing isn't heroic. Growing is heroic. Killing does what? Always and only. It takes life. No matter what the cause is. It might be a quote-unquote Augustinian justified killing. Okay? It might be self-defense, if you want. But growing always does what? It always brings life. Always. That's never evil. You know, I guess unless you're growing poppies for opium or something. But still, even the poppies in and of themselves are not evil. It's the uses to which they're put.
Because sometimes morphine is a good thing. Administered after surgery, it's a
very good thing.
Very good thing. I was thinking
This is good.
It's almost like the argument, the apologetics based on anthropology, where you can look across any society, Christian or otherwise, and nobody builds a statue to a man who was an adulterer or a liar for their adultery or for their lies. They may have done other things that were noble, but in every society, and it's because of how we're made and the image that we're made in, and we have the law of God written on our hearts, and we can't find things to that.
Yeah, and I think that final thing, the law of God written on our hearts, is so extremely important. You know, when it comes to, for example, literary criticism of periods of literature that are not our own, meaning previous. Because, should I go there? What the heck? The majority of modern literary critics, one, do not understand historic Christianity today, and they have no understanding of historic Christianity of the past.
Or much understanding of history, period.
Well, some of them do. A lot of them do. But
I was going to ask you comment on the novel question earlier about like Harold Bloom, his commentary on Lord of the Rings, and like it's not a modern novel, and the difference in like chronology that Tolkien writes and the modern novel subjectivist.
Right. Let me follow up this first, because I just finished teaching my graduate course in Beowulf. Beowulf, Anglo-Saxon poem, 3,182 lines, not in modern English, so that I have to spend an entire semester teaching the students how to read Old English. And then they start Beowulf, and the entire semester they translate all 3,182 lines into modern English, into their modern English. Okay? Well, what that means is not only do they have to translate the literal lines, but they have to understand the ideas that those lines embed. Okay? Many of which are entirely foreign to a modern audience. And I don't mean foreign like the Czech language is foreign to me as an English speaker. I mean foreign like another planet foreign. Okay? And part of that is this idea by Christian authors from the proverbial dark ages. There is nothing dark about them. Talk about that another time.
Amen. That
Christian authors understood this idea of the noble pagan. Virgil being the classical example in Dante. Okay? Hold on just one second. And that the noble pagan operates according to the law of God written on his or her heart. So that you can have the character of Beowulf, who does not know Christianity, who is not a Christian by any means, not even a Buthodist, okay? Not even close. He's a German pagan. But within the context of the poem, he acts often according to what people would say are Christian virtues. And I think that's because he still has the law of God written on his heart. He is still operating according to the best that he knows. Does he have revealed Christianity? No, he does not. Go ahead.
Along that line, would you consider the Divine Comedy a fairy tale? And we've got in the Purgatorio, you have Saladin, the virtuous pagan, and of course everyone that is in purgatory eventually gets to heaven, which is a very interesting argument. Would you consider the Divine Comedy?
Wow. Okay, off the cuff. Yeah, I think so. It kind of fits Tolkien's paradigm. I mean, it's often read entirely as satire. Okay.
It's got the opening.
It's got the opening. It's got the resting strangeness down pat. It's got the consolation. But, Dante wasn't the first to have this idea of the virtuous pagan into heaven. I mean, some of the early church fathers suggest people like Aeschylus and Sophocles, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates will be in heaven. Why? Again, because they followed what they knew at the time. They didn't go against it. Like, for example, if you take Socrates, like the Senate did. I mean, the Senate in Greece that sentenced him to death, they were going against what they knew to be true. They knew Socrates was in the right. But, shut up. Probably my kids. They knew Socrates was right, but they can't have him doing what? Disturbing society. Because, revolutions come that way. All right? So, yeah, I think it's possible. It's a very interesting question. I'll have to consider that because I'm probably going to be teaching Divine Comedy this fall. Thank you.
My last comment, and I'll relinquish the mic. A friend of mine who's been here before, and others may know John Carswell, he wrote a couple of years ago Tolkien's Requiem, which is an introduction for those. It's a story of Beren and Luthien. It gives the background, and he just says, here's what's going on here. And he did this largely, and he wrote some background, some introduction, largely as a work for those who have tried to read the Silmarillion and haven't been able to really make any headway. People like me. People like, who also can't read Charles Williams.
Silmarillion is the best thing Tolkien ever wrote, even though he didn't write it actually. But
so, anyways, it's a 72-page summary, Tolkien's Requiem, and I meant to bring a bunch of copies to pass out tonight, but I couldn't. I'll try to bring them maybe the next meeting. But shameless plug, John Carswell's Tolkien's Requiem, and if someone wants, I can give them this copy. Maybe bring others.
Beren and Luthien, if you're not familiar, Beren and Luthien is a great love story in the Silmarillion, and the two names, along with their real names, that Tolkien had inscribed on his and his wife's gravestone. Luthien was Edith Pratt, and Beren was J.R.R. Tolkien. And his son, as he does, is now coming out with a separate edition of The Tale of Beren and Luthien because he's just mining Tolkien's material for as much moolah as it will produce.
Well, I was just going to ask you I'm interested from a perspective of creating art and the authorial craft, I guess. In what you were saying, what does an artist do? And by way of practicing writing or creating, looking at Lord of the Rings as our example of the night, there's based in the meaning is really baked in to the events of the story. similar to what you're describing with Lucy going through the wardrobe.
Right.
There's not a lot of fluff there.
Right.
And that's kind of like Lewis talks about McDonald's stories. There's nothing to add to the story
Right.
through better writing or other skill, versus that, back to the chronicle and novel,
Right.
modern, Harold Bloom kind of a critical theory perspective on modern writing. So can you comment on, I know it's not exactly a question. Is that...
Tolkien says the meaning. He says in one of his letters, the meaning of The Lord of the Rings is found in the atmosphere of the story. Okay, now think about what that means for a moment. That atmosphere doesn't mean speeches. And this is this idea of the air of the perilous realm. That is, it's something you imbibe. It's something you breathe in while you're there. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean it's not partially expressed through the speeches. Okay? It is expressed through the speeches. But, you said earlier, the Lord of the Rings is at its base a Christian kind of story. I don't know that I would agree with that. And here's why. The Lord of the Rings, per se, does not present a quote-unquote Christian hope. I mean, yes, Frodo goes off to Valinor. Valinor is not heaven. Never has been, never will be. Okay? There is nowhere within the Lord of the Rings that you get this idea of one person who will die for all. You get it in some of Tolkien's other writings. You get it in some of the background writings that inform the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, the Lost Road specifically. Okay? But it's not there, which is why I have a real problem, for example, in Peter Jackson's, variety of problems. That's hours of talk. When Peter Jackson has Gandalf and Pippin riding to Minas Tirith, after Pippin has looked into the Palantir, Jackson essentially has Gandalf say something to the effect of, it's okay, it'll all work out in the end. There's none of that in The Lord of the Rings. If anything, yes, this is my timekeeper, I think. If anything, what does Gandalf say? It's our job to take care of evil in our time. Evil will rise again later. It's their job to take care of evil in their time. The shadow always reforms. It always takes another shape. And in that sense, I mean, you could read it as, man, this is just Manichaean. It's just dualistic. It's the yin and yang of good and evil forever battling. It's Susan Cooper's Darkest Rising sequence, which essentially says, good won't ultimately win. Evil won't ultimately win. They'll go on for eternity fighting each other.
Resolved sometime in the 70s, and now everything is better.
Say that again?
At the end of the Darkest Rising sequence, she has this big climactic battle sometime in the 1970s, and posits that everything since then has been ours to make what we will of it. Which is
more battle.
An interesting author to raise in here is Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is not a Christian by any means. And yet Read Neverwhere, one of his little recognized or lesser recognized novels, because the novel is based on the BBC series. It's not the other way around. Okay? And yet the novel is full of quote-unquote Christian ideas. Like looking out for your neighbor, sacrificing yourself for your neighbor, doing good to those who won't do good to you. I mean, it opens with a guy who's on his way. He's gonna miss a business meeting. It's really important. And there's a woman who stumbles out of a wall. How? He's not sure. But she stumbles out of a wall right in front of him. And he helps her. He thinks, I should step over her so I'm not late for my meeting. Boss is going to fire me. Girlfriend's going to, break off the engagement. This is just not going to be good. And he stops and helps her. And that leads to one domino after another. So that he goes off into the underworld of London, down into the tube system and what is beneath. It's just a fantastic novel. But you compare that with something like Stardust, which is just crap. Or at least the film version is. Because in Stardust, Gaiman takes all this fantasy and fairy tale ideas and he pokes fun at it. And Tolkien says in fairy story, that's the one thing you can't do in fairy stories. You can't hold up the fairy story for ridicule, for satire. It has to be elevating. It has to be ennobling. Okay? And Gaiman all too often, his fairy American Gods is like this, man. It's a depressing read. Okay? You read it and you kind of come away kind of feeling like you need to take a shower. Intellectually. Like your mind has been sullied. To some extent, it's like reading some, not all, some of Stephen King's Dark Tower series. Some of Stephen King's Dark Tower series could easily have been written by an Orthodox Christian. Other parts of it, you would think Satan wrote. And, maybe that battle's going on with him. Other questions?
Have you read Thomas Howard's The Chance of the Dance?
Yes.
I was just thinking about that when you're talking about we need more Christians writing books, particularly after what the Enlightenment has done to our world today and scientism and the idea that we've really lost our vision of the transcendent.
Oh, yeah, entirely.
And how the incarnation has impacted everything. And I think it's just a lovely contrast between the light of the Dark Ages, the medieval era versus now.
Yeah, not only have we lost the sense of the transcendent, we've lost the sense of any meaning, even being possible, because of, I think, the widespread acceptance and teaching of 20th century philosophies in high schools and colleges. I mean, you have to face it, the university is nihilist. It really is. It is no longer, hasn't been, at least since I've been in it, about a pursuit of truth or knowledge. It's about job skills. I don't care whether you're at MTSU or Harvard. It's about
the life of the university.
It's about
prolonging the life.
Well, yeah. It's about filling these.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter the caliber of the brain that sits in that chair. It's about putting a brain, or at least another body part, in that chair. Filling, the coffers is essentially, and Ed speaks from experience. Okay? Yeah, I mean, that's entirely what it's about. So when I, in my classes, try to teach stuff that imparts some kind of meaning, there's some resistance on some part, but my experience over the last 23 years has been there's a lot more acceptance on the part of students. In fact, there's a lot more of the, man, I wish I had heard some of this before. Or, why don't my other teachers say or do some of this? Why can't we talk about these ideas in other classes? And I'm usually like, because they don't believe these ideas in your other classes. They're a bunch of nihilists. It's not about meaning. It's about getting along and getting what you want out of life. Again, what does that mean? I mean, my son graduated last Saturday. The speaker was the Williamson County Superintendent of Schools. I'm sure it's a perfectly nice man. He gave a 9-minute speech, used a mnemonic device, today, referenced the Beatles for the Y and yesterday, and it was all about you. And I leaned over to my wife and said, if anybody ever asked me, which they never would, to deliver one of these speeches, I would tell the graduates, it's not about you. It's never about you. It's about the person sitting next to you. It's about the person sitting in front of you and behind you. It's about your boss. It's about your customer. It's about your wife, your husband, your son, your daughter. If you always put you at the front of everything, you will never have eyes to see or ears to hear. Because you'll be looking in a mirror. You'll be Narcissus your entire life. And what these stories, I think at least, tend to do is they turn that gaze outward. They force you to look outwardly.
Which is Christianity.
Yeah, entirely.
Loving God, loving other, loving my neighbor.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Christ didn't say, give your enemies a kick in the you-know-what. He said, love your enemies. He doesn't say, love your enemies if. Love your enemies. In that we were dead in sin, he first loved us. I mean, Calvin really goes off on that, according to Calvinism, in that we were dead in sin, it's like Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan is chained there to the lake of fire, and God has to look down at him and kind of nod, and Satan can come up. Okay? I mean, you can get that extreme if you want. I don't think it is that extreme, but it's all about doing for someone else. And you see that repeatedly in these novels. Obi-Wan does for Luke. Luke does for Obi-Wan. Luke does for Leia. Leia does for Luke. Han does for Luke. They look at times to be out for themselves. I mean, that scene with Han Solo. Well, you go off and you save yourself. That's what you do best, Luke says to him. You catastrophe. Han's the one who comes back and saves the day. If he came back, Luke never would have been able to blow up the Death Star. Okay? So the other thing, and I'll stop with this unless there are more questions, that I didn't touch on, every one of these stories that I've talked about, and all fantasy literature, emphasizes this idea of community. We're in it together. There is no rugged individualism. There is no, pull myself up by my bootstraps and I'm going to conquer the world. The characters who try that fail. That's what the character Taran tries in the Chronicles of Prydain. It's only when he learns, I got to work with others. Frodo tries that, and he realizes there's a conspiracy of his friends. And he has to accept their help. He has to accept their help. If he doesn't accept their help, what happens? He dies. Harry never would have lived to see his 17th birthday if he hadn't accepted the help of Ron and Hermione. Okay? So what does that mean? It seems like they're all saying, turn to others. Not only help others, turn to others. Unite. Form a group. Dumbledore says, as long as we're all united in a common goal, and you could talk about that politically or militarily, as long as the coalition is united against ISIS, well, what happens when the coalition, where the United States is against the Kurds, who are against the Turks, who are against the Russians, who are against the Iranians, who are against the United States? Well, then nothing good's going to happen. Okay, anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.